There are moments in the history of our planet that we can only approach through imagination, moments so distant that they seem like myths, yet so present that they live in the land beneath our feet, and the memories written in our very bodies. The Ice Age is one of those moments, a world where ice stretched across the horizon, where winds carried the sound of glaciers groaning in the distance, and where life, fragile yet unyielding, found ways to endure. People often wonder, what force could make an entire planet grow cold, then warm again, shaping mountains, seas, and migrations that still echo in us today? The question is not only about science, but about identity. What lessons did our ancestors carry from those frozen nights, from the fires they built against the dark, from the stories they painted in ochre and charcoal on cave walls? To look back at the Ice Age is not to peer into a dead past, it is to listen to a quieter rhythm of Earth itself, one that still lingers in the patterns of our climate, our myths, and our survival. As we step into this journey together, imagine the frost beneath your feet and the endless sky above, and let the echoes of that ancient world unfold around you. If you feel at home here, stay with us at Arcane Skies, leave a like, subscribe if you wish, and share in the comments where and when you're watching this story come alive. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a world that no longer exists. The air is sharp, the sky pale, and before you rises not a mountain of stone, but a wall of ice, stretching farther than sight can carry. This is not a frozen wasteland, not the static silence that the word ice might conjure, but a living frontier, restless and immense. The Ice Age did not arrive in a single sweep, as if the world had suddenly drawn a blanket across itself. It crept in slowly, summer by summer, winter by winter, until one day the forests thinned, rivers froze longer, and the land itself seemed to sigh under the weight of cold. The ancestors who lived through these changes did not know they were part of an epoch. For them, each day was simply life, measured in the warmth of a fire, the cry of a hunting party returning with meat, or the harsh silence when the hunt failed. Yet in the long rhythm of the earth, they were witnesses to a transformation that would sculpt entire continents. When snow lingers longer than it should, something subtle begins. A patch of white that usually disappears in spring stubbornly remains into summer. The next year, the patch is larger, and the following year, larger still. Over time, the snow presses upon itself, compressing under its own weight until it hardens into ice. This is how a glacier is born, not in a roar, but in a whisper, a steady layering of winters that refuse to leave. Once it takes hold, the glacier begins to move, almost imperceptibly, a river of ice creeping forward inch by inch. A single lifetime might not notice it, but over centuries it swallows valleys, grinds mountains into jagged peaks, and pushes boulders as casually as a child nudges pebbles across a floor. To live near such a force was to inhabit a land that was never still. The scale of it is almost impossible to hold in the mind. The Laurentide ice sheet in North America, spread across millions of square kilometres, a thickness of ice that in places rose higher than the tallest modern skyscrapers. Across the Atlantic, Scandinavia disappeared beneath another sheet, while in the southern hemisphere, even the highlands of New Zealand and South America gleamed with their own crowns of ice. From above, the planet would have looked like a marble wrapped in white, its darker forests and grasslands pressed southward, its oceans drawn back as water became trapped in frozen mass. Sea levels fell by more than 100 metres. What was once shallow coastline transformed into broad plains. Land bridges emerged, silent invitations for animals and humans to wander into new territories. The world was not uniform in its cold. At the equator, jungles still grew, deserts still shifted in waves of heat, and rivers still ran. But these regions too felt the tug of the ice. As so much water locked itself away, the air dried. Deserts expanded, forests shrank, and open plains stretched far across the continents. This was the stage upon which life reorganized itself, not in defiance of the cold, but in dialogue with it. The mammoth steppe, as scientists now call it, was a vast belt of grassland that circled the northern world. Imagine endless horizons of dry grass, broken only by herds of shaggy beasts trudging forward, their breath rising in clouds that drifted away on the wind. It was harsh, but it was also astonishingly alive. Into this world came the giants. Woolly mammoths marched in long lines, tusks curving outward like ivory crescents, their coats swaying in the wind as they pushed through snow to reach the grasses beneath. Bison gathered in herds that thundered across the frozen ground, their hooves drumming a rhythm older than memory. Musk oxen formed tight circles against predators, low and broad, with pelts so dense that snow clung to them without melting. Above them, in the pale skies, vultures wheeled, waiting for the inevitable moment when a predator's strike would leave a carcass exposed. Predators thrived here too, shaped by the cold into hunters of mythic proportion. Saber-toothed cats, with their curved fangs gleaming like daggers, crouched in ambush among the sparse shrubs, waiting for an unwary bison to step close. Dire wolves, larger and heavier than their modern cousins, moved in packs, their howls rolling across the plains. Even the lions of this age were not the lions we know today, but cave lions, nearly twice the size, lean and coordinated, hunters of formidable strategy. To live in this world, whether beast or human, was to accept constant awareness. Danger was never far, hunger never satisfied for long. And yet, for all its severity, the Ice Age was not a single story of survival. It was also a story of transformation. Plants adapted, sending roots deep into the thin, dusty soil. Some grew low to the ground, clinging close to warmth and resisting the winds. Others endured long darkness and then burst into furious growth when the short summers came. Insects produced natural antifreeze in their blood, tiny miracles that kept their cells from freezing solid. Birds chose. Some fled south each year, others braved the snow. Their feathers thickened, their bodies burning with the heat of relentless metabolism. Each adaptation was an answer to the same question, whispered by the cold. How will you endure me? Humans, fragile compared to the beasts around them, carried their answer in ingenuity. They stitched furs together with bone needles, layering clothing that trapped heat. They built shelters low to the ground, sometimes from wood and hide, but in the treeless plains they used what the land offered: mammoth bones, rib cages, tusks, lashed together and covered with skins. Fire was their truest ally. A flicker of flame meant more than warmth, it meant survival. Around the glow, families huddled, sharing meat from a successful hunt, mending tools, whispering stories to children as the wind howled just outside. These were not just shelters, they were sanctuaries, fragile circles of light in a world otherwise ruled by shadow and cold. What they may not have realized is that even as they survived, they were becoming something new. To hunt a mammoth demanded not only strength, but cooperation, patience, and strategy. A single person could not bring down such a creature, but together, coordinated, armed with sharpened spears tipped with stone, they could. Knowledge passed from one generation to the next, how to track herds, how to read the snow, how to find safe water in a frozen land. Around those fires, they told these lessons as stories, not as lectures, weaving memory and myth together until survival itself became culture. This was the Ice Age at its beginning, a slow, almost imperceptible tightening of winter's grip that remade the world in ice and dust. A time when glaciers advanced not with thunder, but with patience, leaving behind valleys, rivers, and scars that we still see today. A time when giants walked the earth, when predators moved like shadows, and when humans began the long, fragile process of learning how to endure not just the cold, but the vastness of time itself. The ice did not simply rest upon the land like a still sheet of glass. It moved. It moved with a patience too vast for any single pair of eyes to see, yet with a power so immense that whole mountains bowed before it. To understand the Ice Age is to imagine a river frozen solid, not in place but in motion. Every glacier was such a river, flowing inch by inch, grinding the stone beneath it into fine dust, sculpting valleys into U-shapes that even today tell of its long passage. A human could live and die within sight of this frozen wall and never see it advance, but the evidence lay all around in boulders carried for miles and left stranded in open fields, silent markers of journeys they never chose to make. If you walked across the northern lands during those ages, you would have seen landscapes still raw, stripped bare by the weight of the ice. Where forests once stood, there were now plains of stone and gravel, debris deposited in long ridges as the glaciers retreated for a season, only to surge again. These ridges, called moraines in modern terms, were like the edges of an old map, boundaries drawn and redrawn by a hand made of ice. Lakes formed in the hollows, gouged by its retreat. Their waters fed by melt trickling through crevasses, silent pools of blue reflecting skies that seemed colder than the water itself. The land was always changing, though so slowly that to those who lived there it must have felt eternal. And yet nothing in the Ice Age was truly eternal. The glaciers advanced, yes, but they also withdrew, following a rhythm written not in years but in tens of thousands of years. Summers lengthened ever so slightly, sunlight striking the northern hemisphere at angles that brought just enough warmth to weaken the grip of the ice. This cycle, invisible to the eye, governed the shape of continents and the paths of rivers. The great sheets of ice were not masters of their own fate. They were servants of the sun, responding to its subtle shifts as if Earth itself were breathing in and out, cold and then less cold over stretches of time that dwarf human memory. In these pauses between advances, life surged forward. Forests crept back, rivers swelled, and animals spread into valleys newly freed from their icy prisons. Imagine standing in a land once crushed beneath kilometres of ice, and now green with grasses, rivers braiding across the plain, birds circling in the open sky. To the first humans who ventured into these regions, such transformations must have felt like a gift. They followed herds into the fresh ground, tracking bison and mammoth through meadows that only decades earlier had been barren stone. Their shelters moved with them, low tents of hide stretched over bones or branches, always just enough to block the wind. Each step was a negotiation between risk and promise. Here there might be water, here there might be game, here there might be a path forward to lands unseen. But even as the land healed, the shadow of ice never disappeared. At the horizon the glacier loomed, its face cracked with deep blue crevasses, its edge groaning as pressure built within. To stand near it was to hear a world alive with sound, the sharp crack of shifting ice, the low moan of frozen mass grinding forward, the rush of meltwater bursting free in sudden floods. These floods could carve valleys in days, tearing through the earth with the force of centuries stored as frozen weight. For those who witnessed them, it must have seemed like the land itself was breaking apart. To be too close was to risk being swept away. Yet to live near the glacier's edge also meant access to water, to animals drawn by the rivers, to new ground revealed when the ice stepped back. Animals adapted to this unstable world with resilience that seems almost unimaginable. Caribou, ancestors of reindeer, migrated along ancient routes, hooves striking frozen ground in endless rhythm. Wolves shadowed them, lean and silent, testing the herds for weakness. Above the plains, massive birds wheeled, their keen eyes catching the movements of both prey and predator. Even the smallest creatures played their role. Rodents burrowed beneath snow, carving networks of hidden tunnels where the air was still and warm compared to the surface. They became the base of an invisible chain, sustaining foxes and owls, whose survival in turn made possible the lives of larger hunters. For humans, this same cycle of advance and retreat was both threat and opportunity. When the ice pushed forward, the land grew harsher, resources scarcer, and small bands of families were forced southward. When the ice withdrew, new horizons opened, and with them came the chance to spread. It is likely, in these interludes, that the boldest among them crossed into territories no one had walked before. One such passage lay across what we now call Beringia, the vast land bridge between Asia and North America. In those days it was no narrow strip, but a wide expanse of steppe and tundra, dotted with rivers, wind-swept and endless. Herds of mammoths and bison roamed freely, followed by wolves and eventually by people. To those who walked there, it was not a bridge at all, but a country of its own, a frozen highway to another world. The sheer slowness of these changes is hard to grasp. Imagine knowing only your valley, your river, your hunting grounds, and never realizing that far away the ocean is withdrawing, the shoreline creeping outward year after year. Generations might live and die without ever suspecting that the shape of their world was being redrawn. And yet, across that hidden timescale, the earth was shifting, revealing new continents, connecting old ones, carving channels that would guide the migrations not only of animals, but of entire peoples. In this sense, the glaciers were not merely walls of ice, they were sculptors of history. To walk among these landscapes today is to see their traces everywhere. U-shaped valleys in Scandinavia, the rocky scars of Canada, the enormous basins of the Great Lakes. All of them are memories of ice. The soil of the American Midwest, deep and fertile, is the gift of dust carried by winds from the glacier's edge. The rivers of Europe, their courses shaped by ancient floods, still follow paths carved by meltwater torrents long vanished. The Ice Age never truly ended. It only stepped aside, leaving behind a stage upon which human civilization would later rise. And through it all, one quiet truth persisted. The ice moved slowly, but its influence was absolute. It asked every living thing the same unyielding question. How will you survive the cold? And what will you become once it passes? For animals, the answers were written in fur and bone. For humans, the answers were written in firelight, in stone tools chipped with care, in stories told against the roar of the wind. In this long dialogue between life and ice, something extraordinary began to emerge, a resilience that would carry forward, shaping not only survival, but the beginnings of culture itself. The Ice Age was not only about the march of glaciers, It was about the way the air itself seemed to change. Imagine standing on a plain where the horizon is wide and the sky endless, but the sun is dimmed by a haze of fine dust carried from far away. This dust was born at the edge of the ice. As glaciers advanced, they scraped rock into powder, and when the winds rose, they carried those grains across continents, veiling the sky and settling in thick blankets that still rest beneath the soil of China, Europe, and North America. To those who lived beneath it, the air would have seemed sharp and pale, the light filtered, the sun reduced to a muted disk. Breathing in such a world, one might have felt both exposed and enclosed, standing under a sky that was never entirely clear. This restless atmosphere carried not only dust but snow. Winds howled across the plains, scouring them bare, piling drifts against whatever obstacle stood in their path. A single gust could erase footprints, conceal a trail, or expose hidden patches of grass. That meant survival for herds of mammoth or bison. The climate was not uniform. It swung like a pendulum. Winters were bitter and long, summers short but sometimes surprisingly warm, enough to thaw the upper soil and coax forth a burst of green. Life had to be endlessly adaptable, able to endure months of silence and cold, only to spring into frantic motion during the brief windows of warmth. Volcanoes added their own voice to this atmosphere. When they erupted, ash drifted high into the sky, dimming sunlight and deepening the chill. Scientists today find their traces in the layers of ice, but for those who lived it, the sky itself must have seemed to darken with omens. Perhaps the sun disappeared for weeks at a time, the air thick with ash, the cold biting deeper. Hunters would have seen the herds shift uneasily, rivers freeze earlier, and plants wither in what should have been summer. In such times, survival demanded more than endurance. It demanded imagination, the ability to adjust in ways no creature had tried before. Yet this same dust and wind carried hidden gifts. As it settled across the grasslands, it enriched the soil, scattering minerals that fed the tough grasses of the mammoth steppe. What seemed a barren and hostile plain was in truth one of the richest ecosystems of the Pleistocene. Herds gathered there in numbers so vast that their movement shaped the land itself. Imagine standing upon a ridge and looking down to see thousands of animals pressing forward, their backs dusted white, their breath clouding the air. The ground trembled under their hooves, a living tide that could take hours to pass. Predators followed, keeping pace at the edges, waiting for weakness to show. This endless interplay of hunter and hunted gave rhythm to the land, a cycle as steady as the movement of the glaciers themselves. For humans, the atmosphere was more than background. It was a teacher. They learned to read the wind, to smell when snow was coming, to watch how clouds shifted along the horizon. A sudden stillness could mean danger. A change in bird flight could mean a storm. Every breath was part of their education, not in schools, but in survival. They moved with the seasons, followed the herds, learned where the snow would drift deepest and where the wind might strip it away to expose grass. The world was never static, so they themselves could never be static. In their shelters, the wind was a constant presence, even wrapped in layers of hide and fur, even huddled around fire, they could hear it pressing against the walls, whistling through cracks, reminding them of the world outside. To sleep was to surrender trust, knowing that beyond the glow of the flames, the air was sharp and unforgiving. And yet, this very wind that threatened to extinguish their fires also guided them, carrying scents of prey across the plains, clearing skies after storms, opening paths when snow had drifted too deep. It was both adversary and ally, a voice they could not ignore. Predators, too, were shaped by the atmosphere. Dire wolves padded across snow packed hard by the wind, their paws broad enough not to sink. Saber-toothed cats crouched low, where the dust settled, their tawny coats blending into the muted light. Even the mighty cave lions moved with the rhythm of wind, their hunts timed not only by prey but by weather. A sudden storm could scatter a herd, offering opportunity, or it could smother tracks, leaving predators to wander hungry. In this way, the sky dictated the fates of both hunter and hunted, reminding all that power was never absolute. And then there were the smaller lives, those invisible to the grand spectacle of mammoths and glaciers, yet essential to the web of survival. Rodents tunneled beneath the snow, insulated from the worst of the cold, feeding on roots and grasses, their movements carving hidden highways in the frozen earth. Owls and foxes depended on them, sharp ears catching the faintest rustle beneath the surface. Even insects endured, some producing proteins that kept their blood from freezing, tiny miracles of adaptation. Birds too found their strategies. Some flew south, chasing warmth, while others remained, their feathers dense, their bodies burning hot enough to survive the endless chill. Each of these lives, from the smallest vole to the tallest mammoth, answered the same question posed by the air: will you bend or will you break? For humans, bending meant invention. Fire was not just warmth, it was a defiance of the wind. Clothing was not just covering, it was a portable shelter. Tools were not only weapons, they were extensions of imagination. A scraper made from flint was more than a pulse of stone. It was the product of observation, of learning how pressure and angle could shape rock to meet human need. In a sense, every tool was a dialogue with the world, a reply to the challenges set by cold, dust, and storm. To strike sparks from stone and coax them into flame was to claim a piece of the atmosphere itself, to turn air and breath into survival. When we picture the Ice Age sky, it is easy to imagine only grey and white, yet within it were also moments of striking beauty. After storms, the air cleared to reveal stars sharp as needles, constellations blazing in a way our modern, hazy skies rarely allow. The aurora's shimmering curtains of green and violet would have danced above the northern plains, silent spectacles that must have inspired awe or fear in those who looked up. Perhaps they told stories about these lights, weaving them into their understanding of the world, seeing in them signs of animals, spirits, or ancestors. The sky was not only survival, it was also wonder, an endless canvas that reminded even the most weary hunter that the world was larger than hunger and cold. Thus the Ice Age atmosphere was a paradox, harsh yet nourishing, dangerous yet generous, filled with dust and yet carrying the seeds of life. It was not background, but actor, shaping the stage upon which every creature played its part. To breathe in that air was to participate in a drama of survival written not only on the land, but in the very sky above. And in that drama, humanity took its place. Not as masters, not yet, but as attentive students, learning the lessons of wind and dust that would carry them farther than they could yet imagine. When people imagine the Ice Age, the first images that come to mind are often the giants that walked the land. It was, more than anything, an age of scale. To stand in that world would have been to feel small no matter who or what you were. Across the frozen plains, creatures larger, stranger, and more formidable than anything alive today moved in steady processions. This was not the world of deer and cattle, but of mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, mastodons, and bears so tall they could tower over a man on horseback. Their presence defined the landscape as much as the glaciers did. Among the most iconic were the woolly mammoths, their shaggy coats rippling in the wind like living curtains of coarse hair. Their tusks, long and curved, could sweep low across the snow as they dug for grass hidden beneath the frozen crust. Unlike the elephants we know today, mammoths gathered in enormous herds that could stretch across horizons, dozens or even hundreds of individuals moving in unison, their deep footprints pressing patterns into the ground that other animals would follow. To witness their movement was to witness a living tide, slow but unstoppable, a rhythm that had pulsed through the grasslands for millennia. Their cousins, the mastodons, preferred the edges of the icy plains, where forests still clung to life. Shorter and stockier, with straighter tusks, they fed not on grasses but on bark and branches, stripping trees bare with their powerful trunks. They were quieter than the mammoths, moving in smaller groups, yet their presence was no less imposing. A single mastodon could weigh more than 5 tons, and the marks they left upon the land were permanent. Groves emptied of bark, trails of broken branches, clearings carved through woodland where they had passed. Not far behind were the woolly rhinoceroses, broad-shouldered, fur-covered, and armed with horns that could stretch as long as a man was tall. They were built for the cold, their thick coats and massive size holding in warmth even when winds cut across the steppe. Unlike the mammoths, they were often solitary, wandering through the snow to dig for roots and shrubs. But when threatened, their horns made them formidable opponents. Predators thought twice before approaching a woolly rhinoceros, and even humans, clever as they were, hesitated. To face such a beast meant risking everything, and often the wiser choice was to leave it to its solitude. Yet size alone was no guarantee of safety. Around these giants prowled hunters just as formidable. Saber-toothed cats crouched low in the grasses, their long, curved fangs flashing like polished ivory in the dim light. They were not built for endurance, but for ambush, a burst of power, a leap from the shadows, and their fangs could pierce deep into the throat of prey before it even realized it was attacked. To the herds, they were a constant threat, lurking at the margins, invisible until it was too late. Dire wolves followed the herds more openly, their numbers turning them into relentless pursuers. Larger and heavier than the wolves of today, their jaws strong enough to crush bone, they moved in packs that could hound prey for miles. Their howls carried across the plains, a sound that may have stirred dread not only in the animals they hunted, but in the humans who shared the land with them. A single howl could be ignored, but many together meant the night was not safe, no matter how bright the fire. And then there were the cave lions. Unlike the solitary cats of later ages, these lions likely hunted in groups, coordinating their movements to bring down prey far larger than themselves. Nearly twice the size of modern lions, they combined strength with strategy, their golden coats blending into the pale grasses and snow. To see a pride of cave lions fanning out across the steppe must have been both terrifying and awe-inspiring, a reminder that the balance of power was never simple in this world. Even in the Americas, strange titans roamed, ground sloths the size of small cars lumbered through the forests, their massive claws tearing at roots and branches. Short-faced bears, taller than any living bear today, stalked the plains with long legs that allowed them to chase prey at surprising speed. These were not awkward relics, they were apex survivors, perfectly suited to a world where strength and size often determined who endured the cold and who vanished into it. What united all these creatures was adaptation. Their coats were thick, layered not only with fur, but with underwool, so fine it trapped heat close to the skin. Their bodies stored fat in quantities unimaginable today, insulation against long winters when food was scarce. Even their blood carried secrets, Some species evolved ways to release oxygen in the coldest reaches of their limbs, preventing frostbite from crippling them. Everything about their design was an answer to the same relentless question the Ice Age posed. How will you live here? For humans, these giants were more than scenery. They were lifelines. A mammoth once brought down could feed an entire band for weeks. Its bones could form the frames of shelters, its hide stitched into clothing, its tusks carved into tools or ornaments. The woolly rhinoceros offered thick hides, the bison endless meat and sinew. The reindeer not only food, but antlers for carving and bones for needles. Every animal was both a challenge and a resource, and the balance between them shaped human life. To hunt such creatures was to gamble with survival, but to succeed was to secure more than nourishment. It was to claim a place within the order of the Ice Age. Still, humans were never the rulers of this world. They were participants in its balance, vulnerable to predators, dependent on herds, threatened by storms and floods. Their fires cast only small circles of light in a darkness filled with eyes and movement. To bring down a mammoth might mean attracting wolves to the smell of blood, or lions to the sound of struggle. Every decision carried risk. Every hunt was a test, not only of strength but of judgment. What is remarkable is not just that humans survived among these giants, but that they learned from them. Watching mammoths taught them how to move in groups, how to follow seasonal paths, how to endure cold by using every resource available. Observing wolves may have shown them the value of cooperation, of strategy over sheer strength. Even the threats of lions and saber-tooths may have forced them to refine their tools, sharpen their spears, and rely more deeply on one another. In this crucible of danger, humanity was being forged into something more than a scattered collection of families. They were becoming a species defined by adaptation, imagination, and persistence. To walk among these creatures was to live in a world of myth-made flesh. Imagine standing on the open steppe, the horizon wide and pale, and seeing mammoths march past while wolves stalked at the edges, the air sharp with the scent of snow. Imagine the sound of hooves, the groan of glaciers, the crack of ice, the low roar of predators in the night. This was the Ice Age, not a frozen void, but a living, breathing world of giants and hunters, of prey and predators, of balance so delicate that every step mattered. And in that balance humanity took its place, fragile yet determined, carving out survival in the shadow of titans. To imagine human life in the Ice Age is to picture fragility wrapped in defiance. Unlike the mammoth or the rhinoceros, people were not built for the cold. Their bodies lacked thick coats of fur. Their teeth and claws were no match for predators. Their strength was modest compared to the beasts that roamed the steppe. And yet, against all odds, they endured, not by overpowering their world, but by reimagining their place within it. Shelter was the first defence. Where forests survived, humans cut branches and stacked them into frames, covering them with hides to create tents that sagged low against the wind. In the treeless plains, they turned to what the land itself offered. Mammoth bones, enormous ribs curved like natural beams, were lashed together to form the skeletons of huts. Skulls became supports, tusks arched over the entrances, and the whole structure was draped in skins stitched carefully to block the bitter air. These homes were not grand, but they were resilient, pockets of warmth where families huddled close. The flicker of firelight casting shadows on walls that creaked under the push of the storm outside. Fire was their constant companion. More than warmth, it was protection, light, and life itself. Around a flame the dark receded. Predators hesitated, and meat became nourishment instead of raw struggle. Sparks were coaxed from flint and pyrite, stones struck together until a shower of tiny embers fell into dry grass or shavings, then nurtured into flame with careful breath. To master this act was to carry a piece of the sun in one's hands, to create safety where none existed. For people living at the edge of survival, the ability to summon fire at will marked the difference between enduring the night and perishing in it. Clothing, too, became a kind of armour. Furs were not simply wrapped around the body. They were cut, stitched, and layered with precision. Grass stuffed into boots provided insulation, while hide was scraped and softened into leather that could bend without breaking. Needles carved from bone-pierced holes for thread made of sinew, and garments became tailored to fit tightly, sealing in warmth. A coat was more than covering. It was the boundary between skin and death. Over generations, these skills refined, each improvement a lesson passed from one family to the next, an inheritance more valuable than gold or jewels. But survival demanded more than individual ingenuity. It required cooperation. No single hunter could bring down a mammoth or fend off a pack of wolves alone. Bands of humans worked together, driving animals into ambushes, surrounding prey, striking with spears tipped in sharpened stone. Their coordination was not random. It was rehearsed, remembered, and retold. Around fires, strategies were discussed, hunts replayed, successes celebrated, failures analysed. In these conversations, language grew not only as a tool for warning or command, but as a vessel for shared memory. The hunt became more than an act of necessity. It became the foundation of community. And in those communities, something remarkable emerged. Even when food was scarce and every day carried risk, humans found time to create. Deep inside caves where the air was still and the walls echoed with the faint drip of water, they painted. Mammoths with curved tusks, bison in motion, horses galloping across stone, images traced in ochre, charcoal and clay. These were not idle sketches. They were deliberate, detailed, alive with movement and care. Perhaps they were lessons for the young, reminders of the animals they would face. Perhaps they were rituals, acts meant to honour or summon luck. Or perhaps they were simply the expression of a mind that could not be contained by survival alone. Carvings, too, appeared, small figures of animals and sometimes of people. The Venus figurines, with their rounded forms, suggest ideas of fertility, abundance, or perhaps simply beauty. Whatever their meaning, they reveal a truth deeper than utility. Even in a world defined by cold and hunger, humans carried within them a desire to shape symbols, to create meaning beyond immediate need. In the flickering light of torches, the walls of caves became more than stone. They became memory, imagination, and identity. Stone tools, at first simple flakes, became increasingly refined. Flint napped into long blades, fixed to wooden shafts with resin and sinew, turned into spears capable of piercing thick hides. Scrapers, smooth leather, awls pierced holes, barons carved bone. Each tool was both product and teacher, requiring patience, observation, and an understanding of how stone fractured under pressure. To hold such a tool was to hold generations of knowledge, condensed into a single piece of sharpened rock. Still, even with fire, clothing, shelters, and tools, life was precarious. Hunger was a constant shadow, and every journey beyond the glow of the fire carried risk. Frostbite, injury, predators, any one of them could unravel a family's fragile hold on survival. Yet it was precisely in facing these risks that humans honed their resilience. They learned to read tracks in the snow, to sense when storms were coming, to map rivers and landmarks in memory rather than on parchment. Every hunt was both a danger and a lesson, and those lessons accumulated, weaving themselves into the very fabric of human culture. Perhaps the most profound adaptation was storytelling. Round fires, voices carried into the dark, recounting hunts, describing dangers, sharing knowledge of the land. Children listened not only for comfort, but for instruction, learning where rivers froze thin, how to strike flint for sparks, how to follow herds without being seen. Stories became the thread binding generations, a living archive of experience. And in those same stories, wonder found its place. The auroras in the sky may have become spirits, the groan of glaciers, voices of giants, the wind itself a presence to be respected. In this way, survival and imagination walked hand in hand. To live in the Ice Age was to walk a razor's edge between endurance and collapse, but rather than breaking, humanity bent, adapted, and created. They did not dominate their world, not yet, but they learned to shape it, bit by bit, through fire, stone, hide, and voice. In that shaping, they laid the first foundations of what would one day become culture and civilization. The Ice Age did not crush them, it forged them, and in that forging, humanity took its first steps toward becoming the storytellers, toolmakers, and dreamers we still are today. In the frozen silence of the Ice Age, humans were not alone in the hunt. They shared the land with predators that had honed their craft over countless generations, animals perfectly built to sense weakness, to strike with precision, and to survive by feeding on the same herds that sustained human life. For people living then, the presence of predators was never an abstraction. It was a constant, pressing reality. Every journey beyond the fire carried the possibility of meeting eyes that glowed in the dark. Every hunt could turn into a desperate defence, not only against the prey they sought, but against rivals who sought the same reward. The wolves were often the first to appear, dire wolves, heavier and more powerful than their modern descendants, moved across the snow in coordinated packs. Their howls rose into the cold air like eerie signals, carrying for miles across the plains. For humans huddled in shelters, the sound was both familiar and terrifying. A lone howl might pass without consequence, but when the chorus rose in unison, it meant a pack was near, restless and hungry. Hunters knew the wolves' tactics well. They followed the herds, watching for weakness, waiting until an animal stumbled or lagged behind. In that patience, there was something humans recognized, for they too survived through strategy, not brute strength. To watch wolves in the distance was to glimpse a reflection of one's own kind, competitors and teachers both. Larger still was the shadow of the cave lion. These lions, twice the size of modern ones, likely hunted in groups, their golden coats blending into the pale grass and snow. To encounter them was to face a predator that combined raw power with cunning cooperation. A pride of cave lions could bring down mammoths, bison, even rhinoceroses under the right conditions. For humans, such encounters were never equal. A poorly armed group caught in the open was no match for lions, and so every movement across the plains demanded caution. Tracks in the snow, the low sound of movement at dusk, the sudden stillness of prey animals, all of these were warnings. And yet, in observing lions, humans may have learned the value of patience, of coordination, of striking not as individuals, but as one. The most dramatic hunters were the saber-toothed cats, with their curved fangs like ivory daggers. They did not chase prey across long distances. Their bodies were built for ambush. Heavy forelimbs, powerful jaws, and those enormous teeth meant that when they struck, they struck with lethal precision. For humans, a saber-toothed was a nightmare lurking in the margins, a shadow that could explode into violence without warning. And yet even these formidable hunters were bound by the same rules of survival as everyone else. A failed hunt meant hunger, an injury could mean death, and a cold winter could claim even the strongest cat. To live near such predators was to live in constant awareness, sharpening the senses until even the faintest crack of a branch could mean life or death. But the story of humans and predators was not only about fear and avoidance, it was also about interaction, sometimes subtle, sometimes direct. A freshly killed bison, left by lions or wolves after they had taken their fill, could mean survival for a band of humans who arrived later. Scavenging was not shame, but strategy, and in those moments, people stepped into the predator's role, claiming what remained, wielding tools to crack bones for marrow, scraping hides for warmth. The relationship was one of rivalry, yes, but also of strange partnership. Each relied on the herds, and each benefited from the presence of the other in ways not always obvious. In time, humans began to see wolves not only as competitors, but as potential allies. Somewhere, in the long millennia of the Ice Age, a quiet bond formed. Perhaps it began when humans spared wolf pups, raising them near camps. Perhaps it began when bold wolves lingered at the edges of firelight, drawn by scraps of meat. Over generations, a mutual understanding grew. Wolves offered warning, speed, and companionship in hunts. Humans offered food and protection. From this fragile beginning came the earliest steps toward domestication, a relationship that would echo far beyond the Ice Age. The howl of the wolf at the edge of camp became not just a threat, but a promise of partnership, a sound that hinted at a future in which predator and human would walk together. Even with this emerging bond, danger was constant. A lone hunter could be overwhelmed, a group separated by storm could vanish into the jaws of lions or bears. Short-faced bears in the Americas stood taller than any human, their sheer size making them rulers of their domain. To face such a creature was not a contest but a death sentence, and so avoidance was the wiser course. Yet even here, humans adapted. They learned the art of fire as deterrent, carrying torches that crackled and smoked, using flame not only to warm, but to ward off the eyes glinting in the dark. Fire became not only a tool of survival, but a declaration, a signal that humanity was no longer entirely prey. What predators taught humans more than anything was awareness. To survive, one had to see not just the herd, but the hunter lurking nearby. To hear not just the crunch of snow, but the silence that fell before an attack. The world sharpened the senses until every rustle, every track, every shadow carried meaning. And from this attention grew something deeper, the capacity to imagine. To anticipate danger was to envision what might come, to rehearse it in the mind before it arrived. In this way, predators did not only shape the bodies of humans, forcing them to run, climb and fight, they shaped the mind, forcing it to anticipate, to plan, to create stories of what was yet unseen. The relationship between humans and predators in the Ice Age was therefore never simple. It was not only fear nor only rivalry, it was a dialogue, one written in tracks across snow, in howls that echoed through the night, in blood shared on the plains. Humans did not conquer these predators, not yet, but they endured alongside them, sometimes imitating them, sometimes defying them, sometimes even joining with them. In this crucible of danger, humanity's identity took shape, not as the strongest nor the fastest, but as the most adaptable, the species that could learn from friend and foe alike. To walk through that world was to feel eyes always watching, to know that in the darkness just beyond the fire something breathed, waiting. But it was also to feel the stirrings of companionship, the first steps toward bonds that would last into the present. Predators pressed humanity into vigilance, into cooperation, into invention. Without them, the Ice Age would have been a quieter place, but also a poorer one, for it was in facing them that humans began to see themselves clearly, not merely as prey, not yet as rulers, but as participants in the great, dangerous balance of life. The Ice Age was a time not only of survival, but of movement. The world itself was in constant motion, glaciers creeping forward and retreating, rivers carving new channels, coastlines advancing as seas withdrew into frozen sheets. For the creatures that lived in this restless world, to remain still was to risk death. Life was a journey, measured not in days but in generations, an endless search for food, water, and the narrow paths where survival was still possible. Migration was the rhythm of the age, the heartbeat that carried animals and humans alike across vast distances. Herds were the first to move. Bison, caribou, and mammoths followed ancient routes, their hooves etching trails across the plains, so deep that they became permanent scars on the land. These migrations were not aimless wanderings, but carefully repeated journeys, passed down through instinct. The herds knew when to leave, when to cross rivers, when to climb into valleys freshly opened by melting ice. To stand in their path was to witness a tide of life, thousands of animals pressing forward in unison, guided by forces unseen, yet as real as the cold breath in the air. These movements shaped everything around them. Predators followed, flanking the herds, singling out the weak. Wolves learned the rhythm of caribou migrations. Lions shadowed the bison. Even scavengers timed their lives to these journeys, waiting where they knew the herds would pass, their survival tied to the great pulse of the steppe. Humans, too, fell into this rhythm. They were hunters, but they were also wanderers, following the herds that sustained them. A band might set camp where the mammoths grazed, linger for weeks as hunts were successful, then move on when the animals pressed forward. To stay behind was to starve. To move with the herd was to remain within reach of life itself. In this way, human existence became tied to the migrations of animals, a shadow journey that carried them into new valleys, across rivers, and eventually into new continents. The land itself made these journeys possible in ways difficult to imagine today. Sea levels, locked away in vast glaciers, were more than 100 meters lower than they are now. Where there is now water, there were plains. The Bering Strait, narrow and storm-tossed in the modern age, was then a wide expanse of grassland and tundra, known as Beringia. Here, mammoths roamed freely, bison grazed, and wolves hunted, unaware that they were walking across what we would one day call a bridge between worlds. For humans, this land was not a crossing, but a home. They followed the herds into it, settled for seasons, perhaps for generations, before pressing further east into the unpeopled vastness of the Americas. Other land bridges connected worlds as well. In Europe, Doggerland lay where the North Sea now churns, a broad lowland of rivers and forests that joined Britain to the continent. Families hunted there, gathered berries in summer, fished its streams, never knowing that one day the sea would return to claim it. Across Asia, the steppes stretched without end, corridors of grass that linked east to west, carrying not only animals, but ideas and traditions. Migration was not only movement of bodies, it was the weaving of culture. Every journey carried knowledge, and every camp became a place where lessons were shared. which rivers froze thin, where herds might be found, where storms gathered earliest in the year. But migration was not always smooth. Ice could block paths for centuries, forcing routes to shift. Storms could scatter herds, leaving hunters wandering in search of them. Rivers swollen with meltwater could drown those who tried to cross. Their currents swift and merciless. To move was to gamble, to risk the unknown for the hope of sustenance. Yet it was precisely in this willingness to move, to abandon the familiar and press into the uncertain, that humanity distinguished itself. Other animals followed instinct, but humans carried memory, strategy, and imagination. They could decide not only to follow, but to explore, to see what lay beyond the horizon. With each migration, humans learned more about the land itself. They learned which valleys held edible plants in summer, which slopes caught the sun and stayed warmer, which caves offered shelter from storms. They mapped these places in memory and in stories, passing the knowledge to children who would one day walk the same paths. In this way, migration became not only physical, but cultural, a chain of experience linking past to future. The Americas, when humans first entered them, were untouched by people. The herds had no reason to fear two-legged hunters armed with stone-tipped spears, and the land stretched vast and open, filled with giant creatures. Mastodons wandered the forests, ground sloths lumbered across plains, horses galloped in herds, camels grazed in the grasslands. For those first humans, it must have seemed a world of abundance, every horizon offering promise. Yet abundance carried its own dangers. Too much hunting, too many mouths to feed, and the delicate balance could falter. The great migrations of animals had always been matched by the patience of predators, but now a new hunter had entered the scene, one that thought beyond instinct and planned beyond the present season. Not all migrations were vast journeys across continents. Some were smaller, but no less vital, seasonal movements between summer and winter camps, shifts from valley to highland, journeys timed to the ripening of berries or the spawning of fish. Each step, each decision, was a thread in the tapestry of survival. Families knew where to find flint, where to gather resin for binding spear points, where to collect herbs that soothed pain or healed wounds. Their maps were not drawn on hides or stone, but carried in memory, shared in story, sung in rhythm so the next generation could walk without getting lost. And so, migration was not a burden but a way of life. To live in the Ice Age was to be in motion, to understand that the land beneath one's feet was never permanent. Rivers might vanish, valleys might flood, ice might creep back across once open plains. To endure was to move with the changes, to accept impermanence, to embrace the horizon as home. In this, humans became not only survivors but explorers, drawn forward by necessity, yet shaped by curiosity. Every step into the unknown was a step into the future. The great migrations of the Ice Age left echoes that still linger. Land bridges are gone, seas have risen, herds have changed, but the instinct to move, to seek beyond the horizon remains. It is etched into our bones, carried in our stories, whispered in our restless desire to see what lies beyond the next ridge. In the Ice Age, migration was survival. In time, it would become identity. The Ice Age was not a single landscape, but a mosaic of worlds, each shaped by the cold, yet offering its own kind of life. To step across its plains and valleys would have been to move through contrasts. Endless grass where herds thundered, frozen deserts where wind scoured stone, and dark forests clinging to warmth where ice had not yet reached. The land was not merely backdrop, it was an active force, shaping every choice, every adaptation, every breath. The most iconic of these worlds was the Mammoth steppe, a vast belt of grassland stretching from Western Europe across Siberia and into North America. It was a land of horizons, open and windswept, where grasses grew tough and low to the ground, nourished by mineral-rich dust blown from the glaciers. To the human eye, it may have seemed bleak, a monotony of brown and white, broken only by the silhouettes of herds. But beneath its surface, it was astonishingly fertile. The grasses packed nutrients into their leaves and roots, sustaining countless grazers, mammoths, bison, horses, reindeer, who in turn sustained the predators and scavengers that shadowed them. This steppe was not barren. It was alive with motion, a web of energy flowing in endless cycles, as resilient as it was fragile. Further north, the tundra stretched across lands locked in permafrost. Here, the ground itself was frozen solid, thawing only in a thin upper layer during the short summers. Mosses, lichens, and dwarf shrubs clung to life, painting the land in muted greens and greys. The air was quiet, heavy with stillness, broken only by the distant cries of birds that nested in the brief warmth. For humans, the tundra was a challenge. Food was scarce, shelter harder to find, and storms more frequent. Yet even here, life persisted. Caribou dug through snow to find lichen, Arctic foxes darted across drifts, and humans learned to move swiftly through these barren stretches, treating them as corridors rather than homes. To the south, where ice released its grip, forests spread. They were not the towering jungles of the tropics, but sparse stands of birch, pine and spruce. These forests offered wood for tools and fire, game in the form of deer and boar, and shelter from the unrelenting wind. Yet they were also places of shadow, where predators could stalk unseen, and where the stillness of snow muffled sound until danger was upon you. For early humans, forests were both sanctuary and threat, places where a single spark could mean warmth, but where the dark might conceal claws and teeth. Water shaped the landscape just as much as ice. Glaciers melted in summer, sending torrents rushing across the plains. Rivers braided themselves into countless channels, shifting course year by year, carving valleys, leaving behind oxbow lakes that glimmered in the pale light. For humans, these rivers were lifelines, sources of fish, routes of travel, and landmarks that guided them through otherwise endless horizons. But they could also be killers. A flood unleashed by melting ice could sweep away entire camps, leaving behind nothing but debris. To live near water was to gamble with its moods, accepting its gifts while fearing its sudden violence. And then there were the landscapes carved directly by the glaciers themselves. Valleys gouged into U-shapes, cliffs polished smooth, boulders carried for miles and dropped in places where they seemed to have no reason to exist. These erratics, as modern science calls them, stood as silent witnesses to journeys of ice, markers of a world in motion. For the people of the time, they may have carried deeper meaning. A lone stone on an open plain might have seemed a sign, a message, or even a spirit, its presence too strange to ignore. In this way, the land itself may have entered the realm of story and belief, not only lived upon, but interpreted. Seasons transformed these landscapes in ways that could feel like the turning of entire worlds. Winter wrapped the steppe in silence, snow burying grass and driving herds southward. Night stretched long, the auroras shimmering across skies so sharp with stars they seemed almost alive. Summer, brief and furious, returned life with an intensity that defied its shortness. Flowers bloomed, insects filled the air, birds nested in swarms, and grasses surged upward in green waves. For humans, this rhythm demanded flexibility. Camp shifted with the seasons, tools were adapted, food was stored against the long cold. Each year was a cycle of scarcity and abundance, a lesson written in the land itself. The permafrost preserved more than soil. It held in its frozen grip the remains of animals, plants, and even humans, locking them away for tens of thousands of years. Mammoths fallen in storms, their bodies quickly buried by snow, could remain intact beneath the ground until thaw revealed them again. To stumble upon such a body would have been startling. Flesh and fur from a beast long dead, seemingly returned from the earth itself. These discoveries may have inspired stories, hints of a world where the boundary between life and death was less permanent than it seemed. The land also shaped the paths of migration. Wide corridors of grass drew herds, while frozen ridges blocked their passage. Humans learned to read these landscapes as maps, following rivers, skirting glaciers, choosing camps where the wind bent less sharply, or where stone for tools could be gathered. In this way, geography became destiny. A valley rich in game could support families for generations. A barren tundra could scatter them in search of survival. Every choice was tied to the land, every story rooted in its contours. Perhaps the most striking quality of the Ice Age landscapes was their impermanence. A valley might flourish with grass for centuries, then vanish beneath advancing ice. A river might carve its way across the steppe, then dry into dust. Even forests shifted, retreating south as the cold deepened, then creeping north again when warmth returned. Nothing was fixed. To live in this world was to accept change, not as disruption, but as law. Those who clung too tightly to one place, one rhythm, risked extinction. Those who moved with the land, who listened to its shifts, who adapted to its moods, endured. To walk through the Ice Age was to walk through a living earth, one that reshaped itself constantly. The mammoth steppe, the frozen tundra, the shifting forests, all were stages upon which the drama of survival unfolded, and in each, humans left their mark. Hearths buried in loess, tools dropped beside rivers, paintings hidden in caves that once opened onto wide valleys. The land held them, tested them, and in return, they learned to read its every sign. The Ice Age was not merely endured, it was lived through landscapes that were harsh, fragile, and beautiful, each one a chapter in the long story of survival. If there was one thread that bound together every moment of human survival in the Ice Age, it was fire. Fire was not simply warmth, it was transformation. To sit before flames in a world of snow was to command a piece of the sun itself, to create a boundary where the cold could not follow, where shadows retreated, and where life could continue against odds that seemed impossible. It is easy, from our vantage now, to forget what a miracle that was. In the deep nights of the Pleistocene, a glowing hearth was not ordinary, it was survival made visible. Fire altered the very rhythm of life. Around it, people could stay awake into the night, sharing food, shaping tools, or telling stories. The day no longer ended when the sun slipped beneath the horizon. Flame carried time forward, granting hours in which the human mind could stretch beyond immediate need. In that glow, stone was chipped into sharper edges, hides were softened into leather, bones were carved into needles. Each spark sustained not only bodies but the imagination. The control of fire was no simple feat. It demanded patience and precision. Flint struck against pyrite released a shower of sparks, but coaxing those sparks into flame required dry tinder, careful breath, and practiced skill. The humblest materials became precious. shredded bark, grasses dried in the sun, resin scraped from trees. Once caught, the flame was nurtured like a living thing, fed with twigs, then branches, then logs. To let it die was to risk losing more than heat. It was to risk the fragile circle of safety it created. For this reason, fire was guarded, carried from camp to camp, embers preserved in bundles of moss or bark so that each new shelter began with the same ancient flame. Stone, too, became more than matter. To the untrained eye, a rock was simply a rock. But to the Ice Age hunter, certain stones held secrets. Flint, obsidian, and chert fractured in predictable ways, splintering into edges sharper than steel. The art of knapping, a strike here, a pressure there, transformed dull stone into blades, scrapers, and points. Each tool was a negotiation with the stone itself, listening for its hidden lines, anticipating its break. The best knappers were not only skilled, they were artists, shaping edges that reflected not brute force but understanding. With these tools, humans reshaped their world. Scrapers cleaned hides to become clothing. Awls pierced holes for sinew thread. Spears tipped with stone could pierce thick hides. And when bound with resin and sinew, the tips held firm against the struggles of prey. Over time, refinements appeared. Blades longer and thinner, points fluted for greater penetration, hafting techniques that married stone and wood into weapons more durable and effective than before. The leap was not only technological, it was cognitive. To envision a tool before it existed, to strike stone with intention rather than accident, was to project imagination into matter. Bones, too, were shaped into purpose. The long ribs of mammoths became frames for shelters, their smaller bones carved into needles and ornaments. Antlers, hard yet workable, were fashioned into handles, harpoons, or flint knapping supports. Every part of an animal was used, nothing wasted, each transformation a testament to ingenuity. Even the sinew became thread, strong enough to bind points to shafts or sew hides into garments. To hold such objects was to hold not only material, but knowledge, the inheritance of countless hands that had practiced and perfected the craft. Fire and tools together reshaped human diet and health. Meat roasted over flames became easier to chew and digest, releasing more energy from every bite. Bones cracked in the fire yielded marrow, rich in fat and nutrients. Plants could be softened, toxins reduced, roots rendered edible where before they were not. The hearth expanded the range of what could be eaten, broadening survival itself. In this way, fire was not only protection against cold, but a key that unlocked new resources. Yet fire's power reached beyond utility. Flames flickering on cave walls created shadows that danced and shifted, turning painted animals into moving spirits. The crackle of wood, the rise of sparks into the night sky, the warmth against frozen skin, all of it carried mystery. Perhaps fire became more than tool, more than ally. Perhaps it became presence, a companion that demanded respect. In some traditions still remembered in later cultures, fire is treated as a living being, to be fed, spoken to, honoured. It is not difficult to imagine that such reverence began in those ancient nights, when fire was the only force standing between humanity and the endless dark. With fire also came new dangers. A spark could ignite a shelter, a careless ember could spread destruction. To harness fire was to wield power that required vigilance. Children were warned to stay close but cautious. Adults kept watch even in sleep, ensuring that the heart of flame never consumed what it was meant to protect. In this constant tending, bonds were strengthened. The fire was communal. No one owned it, and everyone relied upon it. Around its glow, equality held, if only for a time, as all faces reflected the same light. It was in these circles that some of the earliest art and ritual unfolded. Charcoal from burned wood became pigment. Ash was used to treat hides or preserve food. The smell of smoke permeated everything, clinging to skin and clothing, marking humans with the scent of their survival. It was not only physical, it was cultural. To be human was to live with fire, to carry its warmth, its light, and its danger into every corner of life. Technology did not end with stone and fire. Over time, humans experimented with materials around them. They learned to twist fibres into cords, to weave them into nets for fishing or snares for small animals. They hollowed bones into flutes, turning breath into music, proof that even amid hunger and cold there was space for beauty. They carved patterns into tools, perhaps to mark ownership, perhaps for meaning known only to them. Each step forward was small, but together they marked a shift. Humans were no longer merely reacting to the world, they were shaping it. To live in the Ice Age was to exist on the edge of survival, yet in that crucible, people discovered how to bend the world to their will. Fire, stone, bone, fibre, each was transformed, refined, and carried forward not only as objects, but as knowledge. These technologies were not static. They spread through migration, were improved upon, adapted to new lands and challenges. And in this, humanity revealed its most enduring trait, the ability to take what was given and imagine what it could become. In the glow of firelight, with stone tools at their side and music rising from bone flutes, the people of the Ice Age were not merely enduring, they were creating. They were laying the foundations of invention, expression, and culture. What began as survival grew into something more, the recognition that within their hands lay not only the means to live, but the means to transform. Deep in the earth, where the daylight could not reach, humans left marks that still speak across tens of thousands of years. Caves that today seem silent and lifeless once echoed with the voices of those who painted their walls, torches flickering, shadows dancing, pigments pressed by hand or blown through hollow bones. The figures they created were not idle decorations. They were alive, moving in the light, filled with meaning that went beyond necessity. Horses galloped across stone. Bison lowered their heads in challenge. Mammoths stretched their tusks in arcs of power. These images, preserved by accident of darkness and stone, are the first galleries of human imagination, proof that survival was never enough. Humans also needed to remember, to dream, to tell stories with shapes and colour. What drove them into the depths to create such works? Perhaps it was teaching, the walls as classrooms, showing the young how mammoths looked, how bison moved, how herds flowed across the steppe. Perhaps it was ritual, an attempt to capture the spirit of the animals, to honour them, to ensure success in the hunt. Or perhaps it was wonder, the same impulse that moves us still to paint, to sing, to carve meaning into the world around us. Whatever the reason, the act itself marked a threshold. To create symbols is to think beyond the present moment, to imagine something larger than oneself. In that act, humans were not only surviving the Ice Age, they were becoming storytellers. Not all art was vast and public. Some were small, intimate, portable. Tiny figurines carved from bone, ivory and stone have been found buried in the soil of Europe and Asia. Many are abstract, stylized, their forms exaggerated. Broad hips, rounded bodies, swollen with the suggestion of life. These so-called Venus figurines may have been symbols of fertility, of abundance, of continuity in a world where survival was fragile. Or they may have been tokens of belief, carried from camp to camp as reminders of connection, of identity. Whatever their meaning, they reflect a human need to hold symbols close, to carry imagination in the pocket as well as on the walls of caves. Even tools bore marks that went beyond function. Lines etched into bones, spirals carved into stone, patterns repeated without obvious utility. These may have been tallies, calendars, or records of cycles, the moon, the seasons, the migrations of herds. Or they may have been art for its own sake, a meditation on pattern, a way of making order from the chaos of existence. In the grooves and scratches, one hears the faint echo of a thought that reached beyond the immediate, a mind grasping for permanence, for meaning, for beauty. Music, too, entered the human world in these long nights. Flutes carved from bird bones or mammoth ivory have been found. Their holes carefully placed, their surfaces smoothed to carry breath into sound. Imagine the firelight flickering, the cold pressing against the walls of a shelter, and then the sound of music rising. A tone, a melody, something fragile yet enduring. Music, unlike stone or bone, leaves no fossil trace except in the instruments themselves. But its impact must have been profound. It bound groups together, eased fear, marked rituals, carried memory. Perhaps it echoed in caves, mingling with paintings, turning stone walls into living theatres of sound and image. With art and music came something else, spirituality, or at least the beginnings of it. To live in a world where predators lurked, where storms could erase camps, where the earth itself shifted under the weight of ice, was to live with mystery. Why did the auroras shimmer in the sky? Why did glaciers groan as if alive? Why did the herds vanish one season, only to return another? These were questions without answers, and into that silence humans poured imagination. They gave the world of voices, faces, spirits. The wind became a being to be respected, the animal a presence to be honoured, the fire a companion to be fed. Belief was not separate from survival. It was woven into it, a way of navigating the unknown. Perhaps stories told around the fire gave shape to this spirituality. A child might hear how the mammoth carried the land on its back, how the stars were sparks from the first fire, how the wolves were not only hunters, but kin. These stories were not idle. They taught lessons, preserved memory, gave comfort in the face of uncertainty. They were the first myths, born not from temples or scriptures, but from necessity and wonder, whispered in the night to keep the darkness at bay. Even death itself was transformed by symbol. Graves from the Ice Age reveal bodies laid to rest with care, tools placed beside them, beads strung into necklaces, red ochre sprinkled like a veil of blood, or life upon the body. These burials suggest that death was not seen as an end, but as a passage, a continuation of the journey. To honour the dead was to acknowledge connection, to extend meaning beyond the span of breath. In doing so, humans stepped into a realm no other creature had fully entered, the realm of imagining what lies beyond. In all these acts, painting, carving, music, ritual, humans declared themselves more than their circumstances. The Ice Age was harsh, but they answered its cold not only with fire and tools, but with symbols and imagination. They wove meaning into survival, transforming existence into culture. Each painting on a cave wall, each figurine carved from ivory, each song breathed through a flute was a defiance of silence, a refusal to let the world be only what it was. They made it also what it could mean. And so, in the heart of the Ice Age, Amid glaciers and predators and endless horizons of snow, the first flickers of culture took shape. The human mind, pressed by necessity, opened into wonder. The hands that struck flint for fire also traced bison on stone. The voices that called warnings also sang. The eyes that watched for predators also looked up at the stars and wondered what stories they told. It was here, in the crucible of cold, that imagination became as essential as fire, as vital as food. It was here that humanity began not only to live, but to dream. The Ice Age was never a single, unbroken winter. It was a rhythm of cold and warmth, advance and retreat, a cycle written not in years but in millennia. To those who lived through it, the changes may have seemed subtle at first: snow that lingered longer one year, summers that felt shorter, rivers that swelled in ways unexpected. But in the span of centuries, these small shifts became profound. Forests retreated, then advanced again. Grasslands spread wide, then vanished under creeping ice. Seas shrank, exposing land, then rose once more to swallow it back. The world of the Pleistocene was not static, but alive with change, a restless planet breathing in long, slow patterns. One of the forces behind these cycles lay in the tilt and wobble of the Earth itself. The planet's orbit shifted over tens of thousands of years, changing the way sunlight fell upon its surface. When the tilt of the axis leaned more sharply, summers grew stronger and ice retreated. When it leaned back, winters tightened their grip and glaciers advanced. These rhythms, known now as Milankovitch cycles, were invisible to the people who walked beneath them, but their effects were everywhere. A hunter did not need to know the mathematics of orbits to understand that the land was changing, that herds moved differently, that rivers froze or thawed at times unfamiliar. For them, the explanation may have been the will of spirits, the breath of giants, the turning of a world whose moods no one could predict. Sometimes the changes came not as slow adjustments, but as violent shocks. As glaciers melted, water pooled into vast lakes, contained only by fragile walls of ice. When those walls broke, floods roared across the land with a force unimaginable. In what is now North America, such floods carved entire landscapes, scouring valleys, moving boulders the size of houses, leaving behind channels that stretch for miles. To witness one would have been to see the world remade in days. Camps, herds, forests, all swept aside in torrents of water that must have seemed like the anger of the earth itself. For those who survived, the memory would have become story, myth, perhaps warning. Never trust the stillness of ice, for beneath it lies a river waiting to be freed. Even in calmer times, the climate shifts brought hardship. A few degrees of change in global temperature could mean the difference between open plains and frozen tundra, between rivers flowing or lying locked beneath ice. For the animals, this meant migration, adaptation, or death. For humans, it meant the same. Camps abandoned, routes forgotten, new lands sought. A valley that sustained life for generations might suddenly fail, its grass withered, its herds gone. The people who lived there faced choices that defined their survival: move on or perish. The younger Dryas, one of the most dramatic of these shifts, brought sudden cold after a period of warming. For over 1,000 years, temperatures plummeted again, glaciers advanced, and the world reminded its inhabitants that stability was an illusion. For humans who had begun to flourish in the warmth, it was a return to hardship, a test of endurance renewed. Hunters once again faced longer winters, scarcer prey, harsher storms. Perhaps they looked back with longing to times of abundance, telling stories of summers when rivers ran freely and forests grew thick. But the Ice Age offered no guarantees. It gave and it took away, and life bent to its will. And yet within this instability lay opportunity. When glaciers retreated, new lands opened, rich with fresh soil, rivers, and grass. For the herds, this meant pastures untapped. For humans, it meant resources, stone for tools, caves for shelter, rivers for fish. Each retreat of ice was an invitation, and each advance a warning. To endure the Ice Age was not to resist its changes, but to move with them, to treat the world as a shifting puzzle and find ways to fit within its pieces. These cycles of climate shaped not only where people lived, but how they thought. To see the land change within a lifetime, to watch forests vanish or rivers dry, must have impressed deeply upon the human mind the sense that the world was alive, moody, unpredictable. It may have encouraged reverence, caution, humility. The earth was not merely ground beneath their feet, it was an actor in its own right, with power to nurture or destroy. And so, myths may have grown to explain these changes. Gods of ice and fire, spirits of rivers, animals that carried the seasons upon their backs. Belief was not ornament but necessity, a way of making sense of forces too vast to control. Floods, storms, droughts, freezes, all these wove themselves into memory. A hunter might tell his children of the time the river broke its banks and carried away shelters. A grandmother might recall when snow fell so long that food ran out and the family had to leave everything behind. These stories, repeated around fires, became more than memory. They became guidance, warnings encoded in tale and ritual. Do not settle too close to the glacier's edge, one story might say. Do not trust the river when the ice groans. In this way, culture carried survival forward, ensuring that each generation did not face change unprepared. The constant shifting also encouraged mobility. Humans who clung too tightly to one place risked ruin. Those who learned to move, to wander with herds and seasons, found resilience. This mobility was not aimless but patterned, guided by rivers, mountains, stars. The very act of walking, of leaving one valley for another, became the essence of human life. To endure was to move, and to move was to discover. Out of this rhythm of climate and migration grew the seeds of exploration, the curiosity that would one day carry humanity far beyond the bounds of the Ice Age. To stand in that world was to feel the instability of earth and sky at every moment. The glacier loomed, but it could retreat. The river flowed, but it could flood. The herd grazed, but tomorrow it might vanish. Life was precarious, fragile, and yet somehow persistent. In the midst of uncertainty, humans built fire, carved art, told stories, and pressed forward. They did not know when the cold would end, or if it would, but they knew that as long as they could move, adapt, and remember, they could endure. The Ice Age was not only an age of ice, it was an age of change, an endless conversation between warmth and cold, advance and retreat. To live through it was to live within that conversation, to listen, to learn, and to carry those lessons forward. And in that carrying, humanity prepared itself not only to survive the end of the Ice Age, but to rise from it transformed. The Ice Age is remembered for its giants, yet its end is marked just as powerfully by their disappearance. For tens of thousands of years, mammoths, saber-toothed cats, ground sloths, cave lions, and dire wolves had dominated the landscapes of Eurasia and the Americas. They were not invincible, but they were enduring, thriving in conditions that reshaped continents and tested every form of life. And then, within the blink of an eye in geological time, they were gone. The steppe that once shook under the tread of mammoth herds grew silent. The caves that had echoed with the roars of lions became still. A world filled with colossal life shifted into one that looked far more like our own. The reasons for this disappearance are complex and perhaps never fully singular. Climate change played its part. As the last great glaciers retreated, the grasslands that had sustained herds for millennia gave way to forests and wetlands. The mammoth steppe, that vast and fertile plain, shrank piece by piece until it vanished almost entirely. Animals built for cold, open spaces found themselves trapped in a world that no longer matched their design. Woolly mammoths, with their long fur and fat reserves, struggled as temperatures warmed and forests spread. Woolly rhinoceroses, solitary wanderers of the steppe, found fewer and fewer open pastures. Even predators, so long adapted to abundance, faltered when their prey dwindled. But climate alone may not tell the full story. At the same time that the ice receded, humans spread farther and faster across the globe. They had grown in number, in skill, and in strategy. Where once they were fragile hunters, living in the shadow of giants, they had become formidable rivals, armed with refined tools, coordinated tactics, and a cultural memory that preserved knowledge across generations. A mammoth was no longer untouchable prey. It was target, resource, opportunity. The tusks became weapons, the hides became shelters, the meat became sustenance for whole bands. To bring one down was to secure survival for weeks, even months. And so the balance shifted. Some scientists speak of the overkill hypothesis, the idea that humans hunted these giants into extinction. Evidence of butchered mammoth bones, of kill sites where entire herds were brought down, suggests that human hunting pressure was intense. A single band, with persistence and planning, could drive a mammoth into a pit, surround it with spears, or exhaust it through relentless pursuit. Over time, as human populations expanded, the pressure on herds may have outpaced their ability to recover. Animals that once roamed in countless thousands dwindled, then disappeared, their bones left scattered in the soil as mute witnesses to the change. Yet it may not have been simply climate or humans, but the convergence of both. Warming transformed landscapes, shrinking habitats, while humans pressed into every new corridor, opened by retreating ice. The giants, once lords of the plains, found themselves trapped between dwindling food and rising predation. It was not one blow, but many. Each winter harder, each hunt more dangerous, each patch of grass rarer. Slowly, inevitably, populations collapsed. The saber-toothed, master of ambush, vanished when the herds it hunted thinned. The giant ground sloth, slow-moving and massive, could not withstand human spears. The cave lion, once the terror of Europe, left only bones to remind us of its reign. Imagine standing in the final days of these creatures. Perhaps a small herd of mammoths still roamed the steppe, fewer than before, their paths quiet where once they had thundered. Perhaps a lone saber-tooth crouched in tall grass, ribs visible beneath its skin, waiting for prey that would not come. Perhaps the last of the cave lions prowled near human camps, desperate and starving, no longer feared but pitied. To live in that moment would have been to witness the fading of an age, the passing of giants that had shaped the lives of humans for as long as memory reached. And yet even as they vanished, the giants lived on, in memory, in art, in story. The mammoth was painted on cave walls long after the last herds dwindled. Figurines of lions and bison continued to be carved, their forms preserved in ivory and stone. Myths may have carried them forward, transforming them into creatures of legend. Dragons, monsters, gods in animal form. The world they had inhabited became part of human imagination, a place to return to in story, even when the living animals were gone. Not all vanished completely. Isolated populations of mammoths survived on remote islands long after the mainland herds disappeared. On Wrangel Island, in the Arctic Ocean, mammoths lived until only a few thousand years ago, contemporary with the first civilizations rising in Mesopotamia and Egypt. To think that pyramids stood while mammoths still walked is to realize how recent their loss truly is. These last survivors, cut off from the rest of the world, shrank in size, adapted as best they could, and finally disappeared, leaving behind only bones and tusks scattered on frozen ground. For humans, the extinction of these giants changed the fabric of existence. The herds that had sustained them for millennia were gone or diminished. Hunting shifted to smaller game. Deer, boar, fish, birds. Tools adapted, strategies evolved. Some communities turned increasingly to gathering plants, nuts and seeds, expanding their diet as large prey grew scarce. The disappearance of giants may even have nudged humanity toward new ways of living, planting the seeds for agriculture, settlement and domestication. The end of one age became the beginning of another. Yet the memory of giants lingered, in bones unearthed from the earth, in tusks buried by time, in the strange shapes of fossils. Humans found reminders of a world where animals had been larger, stronger, stranger. Perhaps these discoveries fueled myths of creatures half known, half imagined. A mammoth skull might become the head of a giant in story. A fossil bone might be taken as the limb of a god. In this way, extinction did not erase the giants, it transformed them, lifting them into legend. The megafaunal extinctions of the Ice Age remind us that the balance of survival is fragile. Even the mightiest creatures can fall when the world shifts too quickly, when climate changes too fast, when new hunters arrive. The mammoth, the saber-toothed, the giant sloth, they were not defeated by weakness, but by the convergence of forces beyond their control. And in their passing, humanity was left standing, no longer the fragile newcomer in a world of titans, but one of the last great survivors. It was a victory paid in silence. The plains grew quieter, the forests emptier, the nights less filled with roars. The Ice Age had forged giants, but it also took them away. What remained was humanity, bearing the memory of those who had gone, carrying their images into art, story, and imagination. In the echoes of extinction, humans began to see themselves not just as survivors among many, but as inheritors of a world now theirs to shape. As the Ice Age drew toward its close, the world was not the same as it had been when the first glaciers advanced. The vast plains that had fed mammoths and bison shrank beneath rising forests. Rivers swelled as ice melted, lakes spread wide across continents, and the once endless horizons of steppe became dotted with trees, marshes, and new kinds of life. The giants that had dominated the Pleistocene faded, leaving gaps in the web of survival. For humans, this was not only a change in scenery, but a profound shift in how life was lived. The old ways of following herds across open plains still endured, but new possibilities began to emerge. Possibilities that hinted at the first steps toward the world we know today. For countless generations, humans had lived in motion, their lives bound to the rhythms of animals and seasons. Camps rose and fell, paths crossed and recrossed, tools carried in bundles from valley to valley. Mobility was survival. Yet with the retreat of the glaciers, some regions grew stable enough, fertile enough, that wandering was no longer the only choice. the land itself began to invite staying. Where once tundra had spread, grasses now gave way to rich soil, rivers brimmed with fish, and forests offered game and fruits. A camp that might once have been temporary could now endure for seasons, perhaps even for years. The idea of home, fixed rather than fleeting, began to take root. This shift was not sudden. It unfolded slowly, unevenly, across different regions. In some places, people continued to hunt and gather much as before, following caribou herds or casting nets into rivers. In others, the abundance of certain plants encouraged experiments. Seeds gathered for food were dropped, whether by accident or intention, and sprouted the following season. Over time, people noticed patterns. Grain grew where it had been scattered, edible roots returned in familiar places, fruit trees thrived near camps. These observations were the earliest whispers of cultivation. Not yet agriculture as we know it, but the beginning of a new relationship with plants. Animals, too, shifted in their role. Wolves, long feared and rivaled, had already begun their slow transformation into companions. By the close of the Ice Age, dogs were present at human camps, their bones buried alongside people, their lives intertwined with ours. They offered more than aid in hunting. They offered partnership, warning against predators, companionship in long nights, a living connection between human and wild. This bond, fragile at first, was one of the great legacies of the Ice Age, an alliance that endures into our present. The human body and mind also adapted. In the Ice Age, endurance had been the most vital trait. The ability to walk for days, to withstand cold, to pursue prey across frozen plains. As climates warmed and resources diversified, flexibility became equally important. People developed tools not just for the hunt, but for fishing, grinding, weaving. Mortars and pestles appeared, grinding stones used to crush seeds into flour. Nets were knotted from fibres, baskets woven to carry berries or roots. Each innovation expanded diet and security, shifting humans from reliance on great hunts to a more balanced web of resources. Settlements began to change as well. Shelters of mammoth bone and hide gave way in some regions to more permanent structures, built from wood, stone, or packed earth. Hearths became central, not only for cooking and warmth, but as anchors of continuity. Burials grew more elaborate, suggesting deeper ties to place, to memory, to lineage. In some areas, people raised monuments of stone, markers that may have served as gathering points, symbols of identity, or expressions of belief. These were the first hints of community beyond the family or band, the beginnings of societies larger and more complex. Yet even as these changes unfolded, the memory of the Ice Age lingered. People still told stories of the giants they had hunted, the glaciers they had skirted, the predators that had stalked their camps. They painted animals on cave walls, even as those animals vanished from the land outside. They buried their dead with beads and ochre, carrying forward traditions born in the cold. The old world was fading, but its lessons were not forgotten. They were carried into the new age, woven into the practices of cultivation, domestication, and settlement that would shape the Holocene. It is tempting to imagine this transition as progress, as if humans stepped naturally from the wild to the civilized, from hunter to farmer, from camp to village. But the reality was more complicated. For many, the old ways endured, not because they were primitive, but because they worked. Hunting and gathering could sustain families just as well as planting seeds, and in some environments, far better. The shift was not uniform, nor inevitable. It was a patchwork of adaptations, each shaped by the land, the climate, and the choices of those who walked upon it. Still, the seeds of change had been planted. Once people realized that they could shape the land rather than only respond to it, the course of history bent. The end of the Ice Age was not simply the disappearance of glaciers, it was the birth of a new way of living, one that would carry humans into agriculture, villages, cities, civilizations. The skills that had been honed in the crucible of the cold, cooperation, imagination, resilience, were now turned toward building rather than only enduring. Imagine a camp in this transitional time. The fire burns as always, but nearby lie grinding stones, baskets filled with seeds, bones of dogs curled beside sleeping children. A net is strung to dry, ready for the next day's fishing. Spears are still there, still sharp, for the hunt is not forgotten, but alongside them are tools of gathering, storing, shaping. The camp feels less temporary, its circle of stones more permanent, its paths worn into the earth. In such a place, the first steps towards settlement can be seen, small but unmistakable. And yet, even as humans changed, the earth itself continued to shift. The glaciers retreated further. Sea levels rose, land bridges vanished beneath waves. Places that had been home were drowned. Valleys became bays, plains became seas. Communities moved again, not as nomads of the steppe, but as migrants seeking new ground in a world still unsettled. The end of the Ice Age was not peace but transformation, a time when both loss and opportunity walked hand in hand. In the fading of the Pleistocene, humanity stood at a threshold. Behind them lay the age of ice, of giants, of endless movement across frozen plains. Before them lay an age of warmth, of seeds and soil, of villages and monuments. They did not know what they were entering, only that they had endured, adapted, and carried forward the lessons of survival. The world was changing, and so were they. From hunters and wanderers, they would become farmers, builders, dreamers. From the cold silence of glaciers would rise the first echoes of civilization. As the last glaciers withdrew, and the world softened under new warmth, humans found themselves in landscapes that no longer seemed entirely hostile. Valleys once scoured by ice filled with rivers and meadows. Forests returned, spreading across Europe and Asia, their trunks reaching upward in places that had been barren for thousands of years. Seas rose, swallowing lowlands and erasing paths once walked by mammoth herds. It was a world in transition, a world reshaping itself before human eyes. In this shifting environment, people did more than adapt for survival. They began to mark the land with meaning, to choose certain places as special, to anchor memory, ritual, and identity to stone and earth. Long before the rise of temples or cities, there were sacred spaces, a circle of stones arranged in deliberate order, a clearing where fires burned repeatedly, a cave whose walls bore layer upon layer of painted figures. These became points of gravity in human life. They were not homes in the usual sense, but places to which people returned again and again, perhaps for ritual, perhaps for gathering, perhaps simply because the place itself seemed charged with significance. In these acts, the land itself was transformed into story, and the first symbolic landscapes were born. The caves that had sheltered art during the Ice Age continued to be visited. Each painting layered upon another turned the walls into living archives, echoes of generations that had passed. The bison painted in ochre, the mammoth in charcoal, the horse in white pigment, all of them reminders not only of the hunt but of memory, of continuity. The caves were dark, difficult to reach, often requiring deep passage into the earth. To bring torches there To sing or speak or paint within was to enter another world. Perhaps they were seen as portals, thresholds between the living and the unseen. Standing inside with flickering light animating painted figures, one could feel surrounded by spirits of animals, ancestors, and forces larger than oneself. Out in the open, humans began to raise stones. At first, these may have been simple markers, upright slabs set into the ground to mark a grave, a boundary, or a gathering site. But over time, patterns emerged. Stones were arranged in circles, aligned with the horizon, with the rising and setting of the sun, or the phases of the moon. These alignments suggest more than utility. They suggest a deepening relationship with time and sky, an attempt to bind human life to the cycles of the cosmos. Though the great stone circles like Stonehenge would not appear until much later, their seeds were planted in this period, in the imagination that saw sky and earth as connected, and sought to record that connection in stone. Rivers, too, became sacred. Their constant flow, their power to flood or to nourish, made them natural symbols of life and change. Camps placed along their banks often returned year after year, building layers of use and memory. To watch a river swell with meltwater in spring, to see it run dry in summer heat, was to witness the rhythms of the earth embodied in water. People sang to rivers, offered to them, treated them not only as resources, but as beings. In this way, geography itself became inseparable from spirituality. Burial sites reflect this new sense of sacred landscape. Graves grew more elaborate, adorned with beads, pendants, tools, ochre. Some burials were collective, with multiple bodies interred together, perhaps a sign of kinship or shared ritual. Others were monumental, marked with stones or mounds visible on the landscape. These practices suggest a growing awareness of continuity, not only survival in life, but survival in memory, in place. To bury the dead with care was to weave them into the land, to ensure that the living could return to honour them, to anchor identity in soil and stone. The sky, too, entered human imagination in new ways. For Ice Age hunters, stars had always been companions, sharp and bright in cold, clear nights. But as communities became more settled, patterns in the heavens gained a deeper resonance. The constellations, once mere clusters of lights, became animals, ancestors' spirits. Their rising and setting marked seasons, guiding planting, hunting, migration. Perhaps myths grew around them, stories of great beasts placed among the stars, of ancestors watching from above, of fires carried across the heavens. To look upward was no longer only to navigate, it was to connect with realms beyond the human. This intertwining of land, sky, and meaning gave rise to the first monuments of culture. A cluster of stones on a hilltop, a mound raised by many hands, a circle aligned with solstices. These were not acts of survival, but of expression. They marked beginnings of a new age, one where humans shaped the earth not only for shelter and food, but for memory, identity, and belief. Such monuments were fragile compared to glaciers, yet they carried weight. They were acts of defiance against impermanence, a way of saying, we were here and this place matters. It is important to imagine the human experience of these sites. A family approaches a stone circle at dawn, torches still burning, the first rays of sunlight catching the edges of rock. A group gathers in a cave, painting over the shapes left by ancestors, singing into the echoing dark. Children listen to elders tell how the river is alive, how the stones remember, how the stars speak if one knows how to watch. These were not separate acts of religion and survival, they were intertwined. To survive was to respect the land, to honour its cycles, to bind human life to forces greater than hunger and cold. In this sense, the symbolic landscapes of the late Ice Age mark the dawn of culture, as we understand it. They reveal that humans were not only tool makers, hunters or gatherers, but also meaning makers. They sought to situate themselves in a cosmos that was vast, unstable, and mysterious. The land was no longer just ground to walk upon. It was memory, story, spirit. The sky was not only stars, but ancestors and myths. Stone was not only material, but symbol. These early sacred places foreshadowed the great civilizations yet to come. The temples of Mesopotamia, the pyramids of Egypt, the stone circles of Britain, all of them stand on foundations laid in the symbolic landscapes of the late Ice Age. They carry forward the same impulse to mark, to remember, to connect. In the age of ice and stone, humanity began to discover that survival was not only about food and fire, but about belonging to land, to sky, to story. The world was warming, forests rising, seas encroaching, but in caves, rivers, and stone circles, humans planted something enduring. The recognition that places hold power, that memory can be tied to earth, that life is more than breath and hunger. Out of the cold, a new way of seeing the world emerged, one that would shape all the ages to follow. As the great sheets of ice receded, their retreat unleashed a force no less powerful than glaciers themselves. Water. For tens of thousands of years, vast volumes had been locked in frozen mass, lowering the seas, exposing coastlines, creating land bridges where continents touched. When the world warmed, that balance broke. The seas rose slowly at first, then with greater urgency, inch by inch, year by year, swallowing land in silence. What had once been plains turned into marsh, marsh into bay, bay into ocean. To live at the end of the Ice Age was to watch the map of the world redrawn, to see homelands vanish beneath waves, to lose not to enemies or storms, but to the slow, relentless tide. In northern Europe lay Doggerland, a broad expanse of rivers, lakes and fertile valleys that stretched where the North Sea now lies. For millennia, it was a rich land, alive with deer, aurochs, and human families who hunted, fished, and gathered along its streams. Archaeologists today find traces of their tools dredged from the seabed, stone axes and harpoons that once cut through reeds or struck fish in shallow waters. To those who lived there, Doggerland was no temporary bridge but home. Its meadows and woodlands offered abundance, its rivers carved paths of memory. Yet, as glaciers melted, the sea crept inward. Marsh spread across lowlands, rivers flooded wider each spring, salt water invaded freshwater lakes. Slowly, the heart of Doggerland dissolved. Families moved to higher ground, leaving behind the valleys of their ancestors. In time, the rising tide claimed it all, erasing the land but not the memory. Across the far north, another land bridge held equal significance, Beringia, the vast plain that had once linked Siberia to North America. Unlike the narrow strait we know today, Beringia stretched hundreds of kilometres wide, a country in its own right. Steppe grasses waved in the wind, herds of bison and mammoth marched across its breadth. Wolves prowled and humans followed. For generations, it was not a crossing, but a homeland, sustaining communities who lived between two continents. But as seas rose, the edges of Beringia narrowed, valleys filled, rivers widened, coastlines crept inland. Finally, the waves broke through, separating Asia from America once more. Those who had crossed remained, scattered across a new continent, while those who stayed behind watched their neighbours vanish beyond the sea. What had been shared land became an ocean, and the bond between worlds was severed. This story repeated across the globe. In Southeast Asia, vast plains once connected islands into larger continents, only to be drowned beneath the seas that now separate them. In the Americas, coastlines shifted inland by kilometres, burying ancient camps. In Africa, river valleys that had once been lifelines were submerged. Each disappearance was a loss not only of land, but of memory, culture, and connection. For people living through it, the change was gradual enough that a child could grow accustomed to it, but dramatic enough that grandparents might remember a world already gone. Such losses do not vanish quietly from the human mind. They linger as memory, as story, as myth. The idea of lands drowned beneath the sea echoes across cultures. Legends of great floods appear in Mesopotamia, in India, in Native American traditions, in Pacific islands. They may not describe a single event, but rather a shared experience of rising waters, remembered and retold through generations. A story of a valley swallowed by the ocean, of people forced to flee, of gods punishing or cleansing the earth. These tales carry within them the memory of Doggerland, of Beringia, of every drowned plain. For those who lived at the water's edge, the sea was both provider and thief. It offered fish, shellfish, and routes of travel, but it also claimed fields and homes. Each year it returned, a little higher, a little closer, until what once was familiar was lost. Imagine a family watching as their campsite floods for the last time, as the meadow where their ancestors are buried becomes a saltwater bay. They move inland, carrying what they can, leaving behind only memory. For their children, the meadow is already gone. For their grandchildren, it becomes a story. For their descendants centuries later, it becomes a myth of a world beneath the waves. The rising seas reshaped not only geography, but identity. Where once people had been part of broad continuous lands, they became islanders, separated by water. Doggerland's families scattered into Europe and Britain, Beringia's people into Asia and America, Sunda's people into the islands of Indonesia. Each new geography demanded adaptation, but the memory of the drowned homelands remained, binding them in unseen ways. Even today, when sonar maps the seafloor and reveals ancient riverbeds beneath the North Sea, one can almost feel the echo of voices that once lived there. Laughter, hunting calls, the crackle of fire, all silenced by waves. For humans at the close of the Ice Age, the sea was perhaps the most mysterious of forces. Fire could be tended, predators could be fought, forests could be walked through. But the ocean was vast, moving, endless. It shifted boundaries not in storms alone, but in slow encroachment, creeping forward until it took what was familiar. It may be here that humans first began to see the ocean as something divine, something to be respected, feared, and honoured. Out of this awe grew myths of sea gods, of monsters beneath the waves, of worlds drowned and reborn. The drowned lands also shaped the course of humanity's future. By cutting off Beringia, the sea ensured that the peoples of the Americas would develop apart from those of Eurasia for millennia. By swallowing Doggerland, it turned Britain into an island, shaping its distinct path. By erasing Sunda, it scattered cultures across islands, each adapting in isolation and exchange. The ocean was not only a destroyer, but a sculptor of civilizations, carving the map upon which history would unfold. And so, as the Ice Age ended, the land itself reminded humanity of impermanence. Nothing was fixed, not even the ground beneath one's feet. Valleys could become seas, Plains could vanish, rivers could widen into oceans. To live in such a world was to live with loss, but also with resilience. For every land that drowned, people moved, adapted, found new ground. They carried their memories with them, telling stories of what had been, weaving loss into identity, and in those stories, the drowned lands endured. The Ice Age began with glaciers carving the world, but it ended with water reclaiming it. Between those two forces, ice and sea, humanity was shaped, tested, and transformed. The drowned lands may be gone, but their memory flows through myth, through culture, through the stories we still tell of floods, of vanished worlds, of horizons that are never fixed. When the glaciers retreated, they did not leave behind silence. In their wake, the land bloomed again, transformed from barren plains of dust and stone into green realms that spread across continents. Forests returned first in patches, then in waves, their roots digging into soil enriched by the minerals ground fine beneath the ice. Grasses that had long dominated the mammoth steppe gave way to shrubs, thickets, and trees. Birch and pine crept into valleys, oak and hazel followed, and slowly, landscapes once wide and open closed into canopies of green. It was a transformation that unfolded not in days or years but across centuries. Yet to those who lived through it, the change was visible, undeniable. Horizons shrank as trunks rose, rivers shaded, paths narrowed. The world was no longer the endless grasslands of the Pleistocene. It was becoming the mosaic of forests and meadows that we recognise today. This shift brought opportunity and loss in equal measure. For the great grazers of the Ice Age, the narrowing of open plains was a death sentence. Mammoths dwindled, their herds too slow to adapt to dwindling grasslands. Woolly rhinoceroses vanished, their massive forms unsuited to weaving through trees. The saber-toothed and cave lion disappeared alongside them, their fates tied to the herds they hunted. In their absence, smaller animals rose. Deer multiplied in the new forests, their antlers weaving through undergrowth. Wild boar rooted through leaf litter, reshaping soil and spreading seeds. Elk spread across the northern woodlands, their calls echoing in autumn air. Where once the earth shook with the weight of giants, it now stirred with the quick movements of nimbler creatures, adapted to shadows and thickets. Birds flourished in this new environment, where the open steppe had given them long horizons to scan. Forests offered branches, nests, and endless insects. Woodpeckers hammered trunks, owls glided through twilight, songbirds filled the mornings with calls that had been absent from the frozen silence of the Ice Age. Lakes and rivers, swollen with meltwater, drew waterfowl in vast numbers, ducks, geese, swans. For humans, these flocks became new sources of food. Their eggs and feathers gathered alongside their meat. The return of birds was not just sound and colour, it was abundance, woven into the fabric of new ecosystems. Predators, too, adapted to this changed world. Wolves endured, their packs shifting from chasing mammoth herds across plains to stalking deer through forests. Bears thrived in the mosaic of woodland and river, feasting on berries in summer, salmon in autumn, sleeping through the winter cold. Foxes and lynx, smaller but swift, wove themselves into the undergrowth, their presence subtle but steady. These predators were not as grand as the saber-tooth or cave lion, but they were survivors, flexible and cunning, able to shift with the land itself. For humans, this transformation meant new strategies. No longer could they rely on the vast herds of mammoth and bison to sustain them. Instead, they learned to track deer through the forest, to set traps for boar, to fish in lakes and rivers teeming with life. They gathered berries and nuts from the undergrowth, mushrooms from the damp earth, herbs from shaded meadows. Their tools adapted. Bows and arrows replaced heavy spears in some regions, lighter and more effective for quick-moving prey. Nets, traps, and hooks expanded their reach, allowing them to draw sustenance from water as well as land. The shift was profound. Human life, once tied to giants and open plains, now found abundance in smaller, more diverse sources. The forests themselves shaped culture. Wood became a material of endless utility, shelter, fuel, tools, even art. Canoes were hollowed from trunks, carrying people across rivers and lakes. Spears and bows were carved, handles fashioned, shelters framed. The forest offered not only resources, but protection, its canopy a shield against wind and storm. Yet it also demanded caution. Predators could lurk unseen, and paths were easily lost in shadows. To live in the forest was to develop memory, to learn to mark routes, to read signs in bark and moss, to listen for the calls of birds that warned of danger or prey. The absence of giants also reshaped imagination. Where once stories centred on mammoths and lions, they now began to centre on deer, bears and wolves. Myths grew around the new rulers of the land, spirits of the forest, guardians of rivers, creatures whose power lay not in size but in cunning, speed or endurance. The symbolic world of humans shifted with the ecological one, reflecting the animals that shared their space, the cycles of forest life, the rhythms of rivers and trees. Not all lands turned to forest. Some regions remained open, grasslands persisting in drier climates, supporting herds of antelope, horses, and cattle. In Africa, savannas endured with elephants, giraffes, and lions continuing their ancient dance of survival. In the Americas, plains stretched wide, bison replacing mammoths as the great herds of the continent. These regions kept alive a way of life tied to open horizons, even as elsewhere the forest closed in. Humanity, spread across the globe, adapted to both worlds. Hunters of deer in the woodland, riders of plains, fishers of rivers, gatherers of fruit and root. The ecosystems that rose in the wake of the Ice Age were not merely recoveries but reinventions. Where glaciers had scoured, new soils formed. Where seas had risen, coasts thrived with life. Marshes became nurseries for fish and birds. Forests became havens for countless species. Grassland supported herds in new balances. The world was more diverse, more fragmented, a patchwork of environments shaped by water, warmth, and time. For humans, this meant opportunity, but also challenge. The old certainty of following herds across endless steppe was gone. In its place was a world demanding flexibility, invention, and deeper intimacy with place. And so, the end of the Ice Age was not an end at all, but a beginning. Of forests spreading across Europe and Asia, of new predators rising, of new prey sustaining life, of humans weaving themselves into ecosystems more complex than before. It was a world no longer ruled by titans but by survivors, by creatures small and great who could bend without breaking. Humanity was among them, carrying forward the lessons of fire, tool, story and memory, ready to step into a future where the land would continue to change, but where they would always find ways to belong. As the Ice Age loosened its grip, it was not only the land that changed, but the ways in which humans related to one another. In the long millennia of cold, survival had depended on small mobile groups, families and bands rarely numbering more than a few dozen, moving lightly across the steppe. Each fire was its own world, each circle of shelters a fragile island in the vast silence. But as climates warmed, as animals and plants diversified, as rivers swelled with fish and forests thickened with fruit, the possibilities of human life widened. It was in this new abundance that the seeds of larger communities were planted, fragile at first, then enduring, until they reshaped the very nature of being human. The earliest signs of this shift can be seen in gatherings. Certain places, river valleys rich with salmon, plains where herds crossed predictably, caves marked with paintings, drew people again and again. Families who might otherwise have lived apart converged, sharing hunts, rituals and stories. For a time, the isolation of small bands gave way to the energy of crowds. Around shared fires, dozens, perhaps hundreds, of voices mingled. Such gatherings were not merely social, they were survival in another form. They allowed for the exchange of food, tools, mates and knowledge, weaving networks of connection that stretched across landscapes. In these meetings, humans discovered the power of exchange. A tool made of flint from one valley might be traded for shells gathered from a distant shore. Beads of bone or carved ivory passed from hand to hand, carrying not only beauty, but the memory of their makers. Over time, such objects became more than practical. They became symbols of relationship, of trust, of belonging. To wear a pendant shaped by another's hand was to carry a piece of connection, a reminder that even in a vast world, one was not alone. Language deepened in these gatherings, stretching beyond the necessities of the hunt into realms of story and myth. Tales carried across fires, repeated, reshaped, remembered. Some told of floods that drowned valleys, of animals that once roamed and were now gone, of stars that moved like spirits across the sky. Others taught lessons: where to find water, how to shape stone, when to plant seeds. In this weaving of memory and imagination, culture grew thicker, more resilient. Knowledge was no longer confined to the small circle of family, but shared across wider networks, carried into new generations by voice and ritual. Ritual itself expanded in meaning. In the Ice Age, burials and cave paintings had already revealed the presence of symbolic thought. But in the larger communities, ritual became collective, binding not only individuals to memory, but groups to each other. Songs may have been sung in chorus, drums beaten in rhythm, dances performed beneath stars or in firelight. These acts synchronized bodies and minds, aligning the many into one. In rhythm and repetition, humans discovered cohesion, a force greater than any tool or weapon, a power rooted in shared belief. The animals of this new age entered ritual as symbols. Deer, swift and elusive, became embodiments of grace or renewal. Bears, sleeping through winter and returning in spring, became symbols of death and rebirth. Wolves, once feared predators, now companions, took on meanings of loyalty and guardianship. The myths that grew around these creatures reflected both respect and dependence, reminders that survival was always intertwined with the lives of others, human and animal alike. As communities grew, so too did the roles within them. In small bands, tasks had been shared, everyone a hunter, a gatherer, a caretaker. In larger gatherings, specialization appeared. Some became known for their skill in knapping stone, others for shaping bone or carving beads. Some knew herbs and their uses, others remembered the movements of stars. Leadership may have emerged, not as command, but as guidance, the voice of experience listened to when decisions loomed. These roles did not yet form hierarchies as in later civilizations, but they marked the beginnings of differentiation, of human society diversifying just as the ecosystems around it did. The exchange network stretched farther with time. Obsidian from distant volcanoes, shells from coastal shores, ochre from deep mines, all found their way into camps far from their origins. Each object carried a story of movement, of hands that had passed it along. These exchanges created invisible threads across continents, binding groups who never met directly, but who nonetheless shared connection. In this way, humanity began to weave itself into a fabric larger than any single band. Yet these new social bonds did not erase the hardships of life. Scarcity still returned. Storms still scattered camps. Rivers still flooded. Predators still prowled. Conflict, too, likely grew as groups expanded. Resources could be contested, hunting grounds disputed, relationships strained. But even in conflict, the bonds of exchange and ritual offered ways forward. Gifts to restore balance, rituals to resolve tension, stories to remind all of their shared place beneath sky and earth. It was in this crucible of gathering, exchange, and ritual that identity began to shift. Humans no longer saw themselves only as families or bands, but as part of something larger, a community, a people, perhaps even a culture. Their art reflected this, growing more varied, more widespread. Their rituals reflected it, involving more voices, more bodies, more memory. Their tools reflected it, refined through shared knowledge, passed across valleys and rivers. In these connections, humanity discovered not only survival but belonging. Imagine standing in one of these gatherings. Fires flicker across a wide plain, dozens of circles glowing in the night. The air carries the smell of roasting meat, the sound of drums beaten with steady rhythm, the laughter of children chasing each other in the dark. Elders tell stories, their voices carrying over the hum of the crowd. Dancers move in rhythm, shadows stretching across the firelight. In that moment, the Ice Age feels distant. This is not mere survival. It is community, a force larger than cold or hunger. It is the beginning of something enduring. The Ice Age had tested humanity, pressing it into small, resilient bands. But its ending allowed those bands to knit together, to form larger webs of culture and memory. Out of the gatherings, the rituals, the exchanges, the first hints of society, as we know it, emerged. They were fragile, shifting, always at risk of dissolution. Yet they carried within them the blueprint of what was to come. Villages, tribes, nations, civilizations, the bonds of survival had become the bonds of culture. Humanity was no longer only enduring the world, it was beginning to shape it together. The end of the Ice Age opened doors that had been closed for tens of thousands of years. As glaciers melted and climates warmed, landscapes once locked beneath ice turned green. Valleys blossomed with wild grains, forests thickened with nut-bearing trees, rivers swelled with fish. For generations, humans had relied on mobility, following herds and seasons, gathering what the land offered in passing. But now the land itself began to offer abundance, in ways more stable, more predictable. Slowly, unevenly, across different regions, humans began to realize that they could do more than harvest what already grew. They could shape growth itself. The first steps were simple, almost invisible. Seeds collected for food slipped into the soil, sprouting in places where people returned the following year. Roots left behind in camps re-emerged, familiar and useful. Families began to notice that patches disturbed by human activity often yielded the very plants they most desired. Curiosity turned to observation, observation to experiment. What if seeds were placed deliberately? What if they were scattered near camps rather than far afield? What if plants were tended, watered, protected from animals? These questions did not emerge all at once, nor were they asked in every place. But wherever they arose, the answers changed human history. The earliest farmers were not yet farmers as we imagine them. They were hunters and gatherers who nudged the land toward abundance. They planted grains where they had been gathered, encouraged fruit trees near settlements, scattered legumes in fertile soil. They did not yet live by agriculture alone, but they had begun a partnership with plants that would grow deeper with each season. In the Fertile Crescent, wild wheat and barley bent under the sun, their seeds harvested and sown again. In China, rice grew along the edges of rivers, its stalks thickening under human hands. In the Americas, squash and beans were cultivated in valleys and plains. Each act was small, but together they marked a turning point. Humans were no longer only shaped by ecosystems, they were shaping them in return. Animals too entered this partnership. The bond with wolves had already transformed into companionship, dogs sharing hunts, guarding camps and warming shelters. But now other species were drawn into human life. Goats, once wild on mountain slopes, were tamed for their milk, meat and hides. Sheep were brought into flocks, their wool spun into thread. Cattle, slow and powerful, became sources of labour and food. Pigs, rooting and adaptable, thrived near human settlements. Each domestication was both a gift and a responsibility. To keep animals meant to feed them, protect them, and in return to receive sustenance and security. The hunt became herding, the chase became care, and human life shifted again. This transition was not uniform. Some groups remained hunters, following herds across the plains, thriving as they always had. Others became gatherers of nuts and berries. Their lives little changed. But for those who began to cultivate and domesticate, the rhythm of existence altered. No longer were families bound only to the migrations of animals. Instead, they became bound to cycles of planting and harvest, of care and renewal. Seasons were measured not only in hunts, but in sprouting, growth, and ripening. The land became both home and partner, demanding labour but offering stability. With this stability came new possibilities. Settlements grew more permanent, shelters more enduring. Fires burned in the same hearths for generations. Storage pits were dug, granaries built, baskets woven to hold seeds through the winter. With stored food, hunger became less frequent, and communities could support more members. Population grew slowly but steadily, until villages formed where once there had been only camps. Children grew up not in endless movement, but in places they recognised as home, returning to the same fields, the same rivers, the same hills year after year. But farming was not without cost. The abundance it offered required toil, planting, tending, harvesting, protecting from pests. Where hunters could walk on in search of new game, farmers bent their backs to soil, tied their fate to weather, watched anxiously for rain or sun. Crops failed, and hunger returned in harsher ways. Fields were exhausted, demanding rotation or rest. Disease spread more easily in larger, denser settlements. The new life was richer, but it was also riskier, its stability fragile against drought, flood or blight. Still, the benefits outweighed the risks. Farming allowed for surpluses, and surpluses allowed for freedom. Not everyone needed to hunt or gather. Some could focus on crafting tools, weaving, carving, or leading rituals. Social roles diversified. Communities grew more complex. The exchange networks that had once traded beads and shells now traded grain, livestock, and crafted goods. Out of this complexity emerged the earliest hints of hierarchy, of leadership, of shared governance. The seeds of agriculture sprouted not only in fields but in society itself, planting the roots of culture, politics, and economy. The spiritual life of humans adapted as well. Where once caves and stones had been sacred, fields now carried significance. Rituals were held to ensure fertility of crops, offerings made to rivers that watered them, prayers whispered to the sun that ripened them. Animals too gained new symbolic weight, sheep as symbols of renewal, cattle as embodiments of strength, dogs as guardians between wild and domestic. The old myths of Ice Age giants and predators did not vanish, but new myths grew alongside them. Myths of growth, fertility, harvest, and rebirth. The cosmos itself was reshaped. No longer only a world of hunters and prey, but a world of cycles, of planting and reaping, of death and return. Imagine one of the first farming villages at dawn. Smoke rises from hearths that have burned for years in the same spot. In nearby fields, stalks of grain bend under dew. Dogs trot along paths worn into the earth. Children gather berries at the edge of the forest. Goats bleat in enclosures, sheep graze nearby, and fish dry on racks by the river. The sounds are not of mammoths bellowing across plains, but of smaller, steadier lives, predictable, rhythmic, enduring. The horizon no longer feels vast and empty, but close and familiar, bound by labour, yet rich with meaning. In this moment, humanity was stepping into a new age. The Ice Age had taught resilience, adaptability, imagination. Now those traits were turned towards shaping land and life itself. Agriculture was not inevitable, nor was it universal, but where it took root, it changed everything. Humans became not only survivors of nature, but cultivators of it. They had endured the cold, the hunger, the predators, the floods. Now they stood at the dawn of something else, an experiment in permanence, in shaping the earth, in building societies that would one day grow into civilizations. The age of ice had ended, the age of seeds had begun. When the last echoes of the Ice Age faded and the world settled into warmth, humanity crossed another threshold. No longer content to move with herds or return season after season to favoured camps, some groups began to anchor themselves in place. Out of fertile valleys and river plains rose the first permanent settlements, communities not built to be abandoned, but to endure. These were not yet cities as we know them, but they were more than camps. They were beginnings, stone and mud pressed into permanence, ritual carved into walls, memory embedded in architecture. In these places, the patterns of civilization were first traced. One of the earliest and most enigmatic of these sites is Göbekli Tepe in what is now southeastern Turkey. Rising on a hilltop, its great stone pillars were set in circles, carved with animals, foxes, snakes, boars, birds. The site predates agriculture in the region, suggesting that before fields and farms, people gathered here for ritual. Imagine the labour required. Hundreds of tons of stone quarried, shaped and raised upright, all without beasts of burden, without metal tools. The effort speaks of purpose beyond survival. It suggests that belief and community were powerful enough to mobilise groups in ways once thought impossible. Around those circles, people feasted, sacrificed, and told stories, binding themselves together not only with food and fire, but with shared imagination. Göbekli Tepe is proof that ritual and monument came before, or at least alongside, farming, that culture is not a luxury of abundance, but a foundation of identity. Farther south, in the Jordan Valley, another settlement rose, Jericho. By around 9,000 years ago, it had become one of the earliest true towns, with stone walls and a great tower standing against the horizon. The walls were not only defences, they were symbols, enclosing space, marking boundaries between the inside and the outside, the human and the wild. Within them, people built houses of mud brick clustered together in neighbourhoods, their hearths and storage pits forming the rhythms of daily life. In Jericho, one can glimpse the first heartbeat of urban existence, the density, the permanence, the complexity that would one day grow into cities. Across Anatolia, at Çatalhöyük, houses pressed so closely together that there were no streets, only rooftops connected in a labyrinth of clay and wood. People entered their homes through ladders descending from above, moving across roofs as if they were pathways. Inside, walls were painted with images of animals and hunting scenes, shrines decorated with horns of bulls, burials placed beneath the floors. Life in Çatalhöyük was dense, intimate, layered. Neighbours shared walls, families lived atop their ancestors. Daily life mingled constantly with ritual. It was a place where survival, memory, and belief fused into one. These early settlements were not accidents. They were the products of the new rhythms agriculture had made possible. Fields of grain outside the walls, flocks of animals nearby, rivers flowing past. These offered sustenance steady enough that people could stay. Surpluses meant storage, and storage meant permanence. With permanence came investment, walls to protect, shrines to honour, houses to rebuild in the same place, generation after generation. For the first time, children grew up not in wandering camps, but in villages that outlasted them, their lives tied to homes that had stood before and would stand after. But permanence also brought change to human relationships. In small mobile bands, decisions were often shared, power diffuse. In larger settlements, hierarchies began to form. Some controlled the surplus, others directed the labour, still others oversaw rituals. Inequality, once minimal, began to widen. Leadership solidified, whether in elders, chiefs, or priests. With walls and monuments came authority, and with authority came both protection and division. Trade, too, expanded. Obsidian from distant volcanoes, seashells from coasts, pigments from mines, all appeared in villages far from their sources. These exchanges tied settlements into broader networks, spreading not only goods but ideas. A style of carving, a way of building, a ritual practice could travel as easily as stone or shell. Human culture, once fragmented into isolated bands, now flowed across rivers and mountains, binding distant peoples into webs of shared influence. The spiritual life of these communities deepened in tandem with their permanence. Shrines were raised within homes, their walls adorned with images that spoke of continuity and reverence. Ancestors were buried beneath floors, their skulls sometimes removed, plastered and painted, then displayed as if to keep their presence alive. The dead did not vanish, they remained within the community, beneath the feet of the living, watching, remembered. Rituals tied people not only to one another, but to place, to continuity, to cycles of life and death carried in stone and clay. Art, too, transformed. Cave paintings had been made for darkness, for flickering torchlight. Now murals spread across homes, open to daily life. Carvings adorned shrines, symbols etched into stone, designs woven into fabric. The artistic impulse did not fade with the Ice Age. It grew, expanding into every corner of settled life, no longer confined to ritual, but woven into the rhythm of existence. Yet even in these early proto-civilizations, challenges loomed. Crowding brought disease, surpluses drew envy, walls invited conflict, as much as they protected against it. Climate shifts still threatened, with droughts or floods capable of unravelling communities in a single season. Settled life was not safer in every sense. It was more complex, more demanding, filled with new vulnerabilities. And yet, once the path was taken, there was no turning back. Villages begot towns, towns begot cities. Humanity had begun to root itself into the land, to build not only for the present, but for generations unseen. Imagine walking through Çatalhöyük at dusk. Smoke curls from a rooftop hearths, voices carry across clay walls. Children chase each other across the rooftops while goats bleat in nearby pens. In one house, a family shares a meal. In another, a ritual unfolds before a painted wall. The air is thick with life, with continuity, with memory. This is no camp to be abandoned. It is a place to belong, a place where the past rests beneath the floors, and the future rises in the laughter of children above. The Ice Age had shaped humanity into survivors, resilient and adaptive. Now, in these first settlements, humans were becoming something else, builders of permanence, architects of society, dreamers of monuments. They were no longer only at the mercy of the land. They were beginning to shape it, to mould earth into walls, stone into circles, memory into ritual. The world of the wandering hunter was giving way to the world of the village dweller, and in that transformation lay the foundations of civilization. The Ice Age is gone, but it has never truly left us. Its glaciers have melted, its mammoths and saber-tooths vanished, its drowned plains hidden beneath the seas. And yet, in ways quiet and enduring, it still shapes the world we live in, the landscapes beneath our feet, the stories in our minds, the very blood in our veins. To understand its legacy is to recognize that we are not apart from it, but born of it, forged in its cold, and carrying its memory forward even now. The land itself bears its scars. Valleys carved into U-shapes by glaciers still stretch across Europe and the Americas. Erratic boulders lie stranded in fields where no mountain stands, carried by ice long melted. Lakes like the Great Lakes in North America, or countless fjords of Scandinavia, were sculpted by retreating glaciers, their waters filling hollows once gouged by ice. Even the soils that feed our crops today are the gifts of glaciers, ground fine and rich by the pressure of millennia. Every field of wheat, every orchard, every vineyard owes something to the age of ice. We live in landscapes it left behind, even if we no longer see the hand that shaped them. Its animals too remain, though transformed. The mammoth is gone, but its cousin, the elephant, still carries its memory. The bison still thunder across plains, though in fewer numbers. Reindeer still migrate across tundra. Wolves still howl beneath the stars. Bears still sleep through winter. The great predators and prey of today are echoes of those Ice Age giants, adapted survivors of the same trials. To hear a wolf's howl is to hear a sound carried from the Pleistocene, unchanged, still resonant in the dark. Most of all, its legacy lives within us. The skills that sustained our ancestors, fire, tools, clothing, cooperation, did not fade with the ice. They became the foundation of all that followed. Our capacity for imagination, sharpened by nights of danger, and stories around fire, became art, myth, religion. Our resilience, tested by cold and scarcity, became adaptability, allowing us to thrive from deserts to mountains to islands. Our curiosity, born of migration and the need to seek new lands, became exploration, carrying us across oceans, into the skies, and now beyond them. The Ice Age did not end humanity. It began it, shaping us into the species we are. Even our stories carry its memory. Myths of floods, of frozen worlds, of giants roaming the earth, all echo Ice Age realities remembered and reshaped by generations. The drowned lands of Doggerland may live on in tales of lost kingdoms beneath the sea. The roar of glaciers may echo in myths of gods who shaped mountains. The mammoth painted in ochre and charcoal may have become the monsters and beasts of legend. Our oldest stories are not only imagination, but memory, carried from a time when survival itself was a story told by firelight. We carry the Ice Age within our bodies too. Our genes bear marks of adaptation to cold, to famine, to endurance. The colour of skin, the shape of noses, the capacity to store fat, all shaped by ancestral responses to Ice Age climates. The foods we crave, the rhythms of sleep, the instincts of caution in darkness, all whisper of a time when the world was harsher, when fire and family were the only shield against endless night. We are modern, but we are also ancient, each heartbeat a continuation of survival that began in the cold. And still, in quiet ways, the Ice Age reminds us of itself. Glaciers linger on high peaks, shrinking but not gone. Permafrost holds bones of mammoths, tusks of rhinos, even the bodies of humans, preserved as if asleep. When the ice melts, it reveals not only remains but reminders that this world is not fixed, that climates shift, that change is constant. We live in what geologists call the Holocene, but it is only the latest breath between colder times. The rhythms that brought the Ice Age may return. The Earth's orbit still wobbles, its tilt still shifts. Perhaps in tens of thousands of years, ice will once again spread, and new generations will face what our ancestors did. If so, they will do so with the inheritance of resilience we carry still. The legacy of the Ice Age is not one of despair, but of endurance. It shows that fragility can be strength, that survival does not belong only to the largest or strongest, but to those who adapt, imagine, and remember. It shows that even in the harshest of worlds, humans created beauty, painted bison on cave walls, carved flutes from bone, buried their dead with care. It shows that culture was not born in abundance, but in scarcity. That meaning itself is an act of survival. Imagine standing at the mouth of a cave painted 15,000 years ago. The walls are dark, but the animals still move in the light of your torch. Bison galloping, horses leaping, mammoths striding with tusks curved. Outside, the world has changed beyond recognition. Inside, the Ice Age still breathes. These paintings are not relics, they are bridges, voices calling across time saying, "We lived, we endured, we dreamed." They remind us that though the glaciers are gone, their story remains within us. And so the Ice Age ends, not with silence, but with legacy. Its glaciers carve the land we walk. Its animals shape the stories we tell. Its trials forge the resilience we carry. Its mysteries live on in myths of floods, giants, spirits, and stars. To speak of the Ice Age is not to speak of something distant, but of our own beginnings. It is to recognise that within each of us lies a fragment of that frozen world. The spark of fire, the memory of migration, the voice of story in the dark. The Ice Age is over, but we are its children.